Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Case 1. Amanda had been living in her family home in Mirabella, a beautiful and upscale neighborhood in St. Augustine, Florida. She and her husband, James Colley Jr., had chosen it as the perfect place to raise their children. If you took a walk through their neighborhood, you'd immediately get the sense that the Colley family was living a good life. To anyone on the outside, they seemed like the perfect, happy, and successful family. Neighbors often saw James laughing and playing with their two children, 6-year-old Trey and 4-year-old Avery, in the cul-de-sac. The couple was known for hosting lively gatherings, inviting friends over for drinks and celebrations. Even as their marriage started to unravel, Amanda and James appeared to handle it with quiet grace. Whatever struggles they faced stayed hidden behind closed doors. That's why the events of August 27, 2015 were so shocking. Around 9 o'clock that morning, Rachel Hendricks received a message that something was wrong with Amanda. She and Amanda had been friends for years, having met at a mutual friend's party. Along with Lindy Dobbins, the three women had formed an unbreakable bond. They babysat each other's children, supported one another in times of distress, and were always just a phone call away. So when Amanda needed them, Rachel and Lindy didn't hesitate. That morning, Rachel had just dropped her kids off at school. Before heading to Amanda's house, she made a quick stop at a friend's home to get her hair done. It was supposed to be a normal day, but for Amanda, the chaos had already begun. Her usually pristine Mirabella home had been completely trashed overnight while she was away. When she returned at 9 o'clock that morning, she walked into a nightmare. Drawers had been pulled out, clothes and papers were scattered everywhere, personal belongings had been tossed aside, and even her TV had been smashed to pieces. Strangely, nothing had been stolen. Everything had simply been torn apart, as if someone had been searching for something. Maybe at that moment, Amanda realized just how much danger she was in. Maybe that's why she called her friends over, believing that safety came in numbers. But as that morning would soon prove, no number of people could have protected her from what was coming. Inside the house that morning were 4 people: Amanda, Lindy, Rachel, and Lamar Duberly. Lamar was Amanda's boyfriend. She had been officially separated from her husband James since June, but she had met Lamar months earlier in April. Their connection started as a professional relationship, but slowly evolved into something more personal. By June 2015, after her separation, Amanda and Lamar had begun seeing each other. Can you describe how that relationship started, if it progressed, and how it progressed? The relationship started professionally, progressed into a personal relationship, and then we began seeing each other in June 2015. And ultimately, that was an intimate relationship, correct? Correct. Now, Lamar wasn't just any man. He was a force to be reckoned with. A former military officer with an impressive resume, he had attended the U.S. Naval Academy, studied at the Marine Corps University, and even worked at the Pentagon. Sharp, disciplined, and strategic, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had seen and handled high-stakes situations. Amanda met him while they were both working in corporate management at Fanatics, a sportswear company. As her marriage with James crumbled, she found solace in Lamar, a man who offered stability when everything else in her life was spiraling. And on that fateful Thursday morning, when she returned home to find her house torn apart, Lamar was one of the first people she called. And after she got to the house, did you hear from her? I did. How did you hear from her? Call or text? Amanda FaceTimed me, and I was able to survey the damage with her. Lamar, Lindy, and Rachel arrived, each of them hoping to provide Amanda with comfort and a sense of security. Together, they walked through the wreckage, drawers overturned, belongings scattered, a silent warning that something was terribly wrong. While Amanda and Lindy stayed upstairs, trying to make sense of it all, Lamar took Rachel to the garage to assess the damage. Now imagine coming home to find your house completely ransacked, drawers pulled out, belongings scattered, every inch of your safe space violated. That alone is terrifying. But before you even have a chance to process the mess, gunshots ring out. Suddenly, a trashed home doesn't seem so bad. Amanda barely had time to react before the chaos escalated. Outside, a man stood in her backyard, gripping a handgun and aiming it directly at the living room. Shattered glass sprayed in all directions as bullets tore through the windows. His furious voice echoed through the air, saying, "Where is he?" over and over again. That man was James Colley, Amanda's estranged husband. And he wasn't just there to scare them. He was out for blood. Inside, Rachel and Lamar froze for a split second. Then reality hit. James wasn't just shooting into the house at random. He was looking for someone, and Lamar didn't need to guess who. With Amanda in the middle of a messy legal battle, her home torn apart and her new relationship no longer a secret, Lamar knew immediately that he was the target. Without hesitation, Lamar yelled for everyone to run. Then he bolted. He ducked under the garage door and sprinted between two houses in the cul-de-sac, his pulse racing as he put as much distance as possible between himself and the enraged gunman. I left. I thought that was the target individual. And so I was in arms and I left. Now, if you were in Lamar's shoes at that moment, what would you do? Would you leave Amanda behind, or would you make the same choice he did? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Meanwhile, Amanda and Lindy, caught further inside the house, had no way out. They did the only thing they could. They ran upstairs. Rachel followed, her instincts screaming at her to find shelter. Amanda locked herself in the bathroom while Lindy and Rachel dove into the master bedroom closet, barricading the door. Rachel braced herself, her foot pressed against the bottom of the door, her left hand gripping the doorknob with all her strength. Lindy crouched behind a chest of drawers, silent, barely breathing. At this point, James stormed through the front door while his gun was still drawn. He stomped up the stairs, rage fueling every step. He wanted Lamar, but Lamar was gone. Instead, he found Amanda. From inside the closet, Rachel and Lindy could hear him screaming. Like I said, Amanda and Mr. Cawley were outside in the bathroom area, arguing. Mr. Cawley was wanting to know, where is he? Where is he? Where the fuck is he? Amanda was, very upset, crying, saying that he's not in here. I don't know. He's not in here. At one point, I believe Mr. Cawley came over and tried to get into the closet door, and Amanda said, he's not in there. That's Rachel and Lindy in there. That's Rachel and Lindy. And Lindy said, it's Lindy in here. I never said anything, but she shouted out and said, it's Lindy. At that time, I heard a shot while Amanda and Mr. Cawley were arguing, and that was all I heard of Amanda. But if you think James's rage ended with Amanda, think again. His bloodlust wasn't satisfied. After gunning down his wife, he turned his attention to the master closet, where Rachel and Lindy were hiding. As mentioned earlier, Rachel was using her arm to brace the door, while Lindy frantically relayed their desperate situation to the 911 operator. James, growing more impatient by the second, pounded on the door and shouted, "Open the door, open it now." When they didn't comply, he fired. The bullet tore through the door, grazed Rachel's arm, and the searing pain forced her to stumble backward. That moment of weakness was all James needed. He kicked the door open, his eyes wild with rage. But Rachel got lucky. James wasn't looking for her, his target was Lindy. Without hesitation, he stormed past Rachel, giving her the split-second chance she needed. Heart pounding, she turned and ran, fleeing into the neighborhood, desperately searching for help. Meanwhile, Lamar, who had escaped earlier, had also found someone who called 911. But by the time law enforcement arrived, it was too late. James had vanished, leaving behind a house soaked in blood and horror. The once safe home was now a crime scene, a place of unthinkable violence and devastating loss. Information about a deadly rampage in a St. Johns County neighborhood. Investigators say James Cawley shot and killed his wife and her best friend. Loss. Lindy had been shot 3 times. Amanda 9. James had shot her once before forcing his way into the closet where Lindy and Rachel were hiding. Then, after killing Lindy, he unleashed 8 more bullets into Amanda's body. He had started with a 9mm handgun, emptying it into Lindy, and when that was out of bullets, he pulled out his .45, a backup weapon, proof that he had come prepared for something far worse than just an argument. This wasn't just a crime of passion, it was pure, calculated rage. But why? Not much is known about the early days of James and Amanda's relationship. Amanda was 36 years old in the year 2015, a year older than James. She was born in Orlando, Florida, and had built a successful life for herself. Professionally, she thrived, and socially, she was surrounded by people who adored her. James, on the surface, appeared just as put together. He worked in the mortgage industry and lived what seemed to be a stable life alongside his wife and children. To those looking in from the outside, he was a devoted father, a man who spent every waking moment with his kids, teaching them how to swim, always present, always involved. But his sister Crystal spoke of him with admiration, painting a picture of a loving, family-oriented man. But behind the carefully crafted image of a devoted father and hard-working professional, James harbored a darkness that had been with him for years, a past stained with violence and unresolved trauma. According to his sister, James had grown up witnessing terrifying moments of rage within his own home. He had seen his mother, seething with fury over his father's infidelity, sitting on the stairs with a baseball bat in hand, waiting. The second his father walked through the door, she swung, again and again, her anger manifesting in brutal blows. But the violence didn't end there. Another argument, another eruption of rage. This time she reached for a knife, her temper spiraling out of control. And James stood there, a helpless child, watching it all unfold. He saw what unchecked anger looked like, what it could do, how it could consume a person. Did these moments shape him? Did they plant the seeds of his own uncontrollable fury? A defense lawyer would certainly argue that they did, that James was merely a product of his environment, repeating the cycle he had been exposed to. But trauma alone doesn't excuse what happened that night. By late August of 2015, James and Amanda had been separated for months. He had moved on, or at least that's what everyone thought. James was seeing someone new, yet his obsession with Amanda hadn't faded. Instead, it had festered, growing into something dangerous, something deadly. Amanda had done nothing wrong. She had simply wanted to break free from their toxic marriage, to rebuild a life of her own. But James refused to let her go. His attack wasn't just a crime of passion or a fleeting moment of lost control. It was premeditated. It was the culmination of his growing rage, his need for dominance over the woman who dared to walk away. And in the end, Amanda paid the ultimate price, for nothing more than wanting to be free. To me, I won't do nothing to you. I will bring this up in court about who you really are. And we both know what you really are. You're lucked out on solid shoulders, Officer Amanda. You're disgusting. That's what you are. Please talk to me. Please. Amanda, I'm running for it. Please talk to me. Maybe I have. Please. This is the last time I'm going to tell her name. Please. Now all of this toxicity comes to a peak when a neighbor sent James a photo. Lamar, shirtless, mowing Amanda's lawn. That was all it took to set him off. Fury consumed him, igniting a relentless storm of abusive text messages and voicemails that wouldn't stop until the day of the murders. In their conversation, he texted her, "Oh, and your boyfriend has been parking at the playground and walking around the back. The whole neighborhood knows. You should just have him park out front like a man. Yeah, everyone knows what you are. Don't worry, I will speak with him face to face sooner than later." Amanda, trying to defuse the situation, responded, "He's not my boyfriend. Like I've told you before, he helps me with the yard work, painting, moving furniture, etc." But James wasn't having it. So why doesn't he park in the driveway if he isn't hiding? And I guess he is married, right? I have a picture of him. These weren't just messages. They were threats. And James had acted on threats before. Amanda had already filed a domestic violence injunction against him, but he had no respect for boundaries. He had violated the order before, once by stealing her clothes from the house and setting them on fire in the yard. In fact, on the morning of Thursday, August 27th, the very day of the murders, James had been in court for violating that order. He had sat there, calm, composed, no one knowing that in less than an hour he would commit an unthinkable act. Now, like many abusive partners, James was a contradiction. One moment desperate for forgiveness, the next consumed by paranoia and rage. Just a day before the murders, on Wednesday, August 26th, he sent Amanda a message dripping with regret. "Please try to start forgiving me, so we can move on. I really miss you and our family being together." But this wasn't love. It was manipulation. His so-called remorse was just another tool to control her, and when it failed, he resorted to terror. In the early hours of Thursday morning, at around 4 o'clock, James broke into Amanda's house. He wasn't there to apologize or win her back. He was there to confirm his worst fear, that she had truly moved on without him. As he searched through her belongings, he found all the evidence he needed to send him into a rage. Men's clothing scattered around, adult toys, clear signs that Amanda was seeing someone else. It was the final trigger. Any lingering facade of sorrow vanished, replaced by pure, uncontrollable fury. He tore through the house like a madman, yanking open drawers, flipping furniture, ripping through her most personal possessions. By the time Amanda returned home around 9 o'clock that morning, she walked straight into a nightmare. Her home was unrecognizable, ransacked, torn apart as if a hurricane had passed through. Furniture was overturned, drawers emptied, personal belongings scattered and violated. The place she once considered safe had been transformed into a scene of chaos and destruction. Shaken and unnerved, she immediately reached out for support, calling her friends Lindy and Rachel. Perhaps she was seeking comfort, maybe advice. What she didn't know was that this phone call would unknowingly set the stage for the final, tragic moments of her life. But James wasn't done tormenting her. Not satisfied with the destruction he had already caused, he sent Amanda a final, chilling text. This time, his words carried a thinly veiled threat. "You're an awesome person. Don't take me from my kids. It's all I have. Call me, or I'm going to come find you." His desperation was palpable, but so was the danger lurking behind his words. It was clear that if Amanda didn't respond, he was willing to escalate things further. Perhaps hoping to de-escalate the situation, Amanda called him back. At exactly 9:41 in the morning, she argued with him over the phone, just 10 minutes after James had left the courthouse. It's unclear what was said between them, but whatever Amanda told him, it wasn't enough to stop him. At this point, nothing could. After the call, James moved with calculated precision. He drove to a gas station, then to his sister's house, where he had been staying, then back to the gas station, this time to buy fuel. Somewhere along the way, he armed himself with 2 handguns, a 9mm and a .45 caliber. His every move was deliberate. He wasn't acting on impulse anymore. He was following a plan, one that had only one possible ending. During his drive, James made one last phone call to his father. A woman walking her dog nearby overheard the conversation and later recalled the desperate plea in James' father's voice. "Please, please, son, come back and get your truck. Everybody knows what you've been through." His father was begging him to stop, to turn back before it was too late. But James' response was chilling, filled with a heavy finality that left no room for hope. "I just can't take this anymore," he said. And with that, he continued his deadly course. James didn't pull up to Amanda's house the way a visitor would. He didn't park in the driveway. He didn't knock on the door. Instead, he parked on a nearby street and approached from the rear, moving like a predator stalking its prey. He knew exactly what he was going to do, and he had no intention of leaving until his mission was complete. The first gunshots shattered the morning silence, ripping through the living room with terrifying precision. Rachel and Lamar, caught completely off guard, barely had time to react before James. "Get down over there. Get back in there. Please stop. Put that down. Put it down," was fired at them. Every pull of the trigger was fueled by a single purpose, to make them pay. Amanda tried to run, but James was faster. He gunned her down in cold blood, making sure she never had the chance to escape him again. Lindy, who had just arrived moments earlier, never stood a chance. Before she could process the horror unfolding before her, she was executed on sight. And then, just as quickly as he had arrived, James disappeared. He left behind chaos, death, and devastation, but he also left behind 2 witnesses, Lamar, miraculously unharmed, and Rachel, wounded but still alive. They knew exactly who had done this. They could name the killer. And now, so could the police. The manhunt for James Terry Colley Jr. began immediately after the murders. Law enforcement agencies worked tirelessly to track him down, knowing he was armed, dangerous, and capable of further violence. That very night, in Norton, Virginia, an unexpected call to 911 would lead to his capture. A distressed woman reported a terrifying encounter on the road. She explained that a reckless driver had nearly forced her off the highway. Describing the scene in a "he just had me confronted to a complete stop in the road and tried to hit me. I had 3 small children in my car. Panicked," she said. Acting quickly, Norton police located and stopped the vehicle. Inside, they found James, along with several firearms. James was officially charged with a long list of crimes, reflecting the full scope of his violent actions. He faced 2 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Amanda Coley and Lindy Dobbins. He was also charged with 2 counts of attempted first-degree murder for Rachel Hendrick and Lamar Duberly, who had narrowly survived the attack. Additionally, he was accused of burglary with assault or battery, burglary of a dwelling, and aggravated stalking after an injunction. The prosecution was prepared to ensure that justice was served. At trial, James' defense team attempted a controversial argument, claiming that his actions were not premeditated. They suggested that he had been in an altered mental state at the time of the killings. A psychiatrist testified that James was experiencing parasomnia, a sleep disorder associated with abnormal movements and behaviors during sleep. The defense argued that he had taken Ambien, alcohol, and other drugs, which supposedly left him in a confused, dreamlike state. In essence, They were claiming that James Coley had been sleepwalking when he committed the murders. However, this defense quickly crumbled under scrutiny. Just an hour and a half before the shootings, James had been present in court, where he was seen behaving rationally, answering questions sensibly, and showing no signs of intoxication. He had explicitly denied being under the influence of any drugs or alcohol during the legal proceedings. This directly contradicted the claim that he was impaired at the time of the attack. Furthermore, surveillance footage, phone records, and witness testimonies all painted a different picture. One of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. The jury deliberated, but the decision was swift and unanimous. James Coley Jr. was found guilty on all counts. Not only that, but the jury also reached a unanimous recommendation for the death penalty. The prosecution had presented four aggravating factors beyond a reasonable doubt, solidifying their case. First, James had been previously convicted of another violent felony. Since he had committed multiple murders and attempted murders at once, this applied. Second, he carried out the murders while engaging in burglary. Third, each murder was deemed especially heinous, atrocious, or cruel. Finally, and perhaps most damning, the jury found that he had committed each killing with cold, calculated premeditation. One of the most haunting testimonies came from the medical examiner, who revealed that Amanda Coley had been fully aware during the entire attack. She had been shot 9 times before finally succumbing to her injuries. The sheer brutality of the crime reinforced the jury's decision. This was not an accident, nor a crime of passion. It was an execution. In November of 2018, James Coley Jr. was sentenced to death. He appealed the verdict, but in 2020, the courts upheld his sentence. Today, he remains on death row awaiting. He described it as executions. Now, James Coley has been sentenced to death. Coley murdered his wife and her best friend while they begged for their lives. Clearly, Judge Howard Maltz didn't believe Coley's explanation that it was all an accident. His fate. Now, what made this case even more controversial was the unwavering support James received from his own family, particularly his sister. Before the trial even began, she stood firmly by his side, fully believing in his innocence. In one recorded call, she even led a heartfelt prayer for him, asking that he be released safely from jail. But what she failed to consider was the devastating reality of his actions. No matter how deep her love for her brother ran, or whatever justification James may have believed he had, nothing could ever make up for the fact that he stole the lives of 2 mothers, women who left behind a total of 5 young children. These children were now forced to grow up without the warmth, love, and guidance of their mothers. Their families were left shattered, their lives forever changed by an act of violence that could never be undone. During the trial, Lindy Dobbins' husband took the stand, his testimony filled with grief and devastation. He spoke about the unbearable pain of losing his wife, about how their children had to face life without their mother, and how the loss had left a wound that would never fully heal. His words were a painful reminder that behind every crime, there are innocent lives that suffer. Little League baseball games are attended with an empty blue chair, for Lindy to sit down and watch Patrick play. Ava's swim team t-shirts were designed with a Swimming for Lindy logo to remember Ava's mom. So if James were your brother, what would you do? Would you pray for his release, hoping for a second chance? Or would you acknowledge the weight of his actions and the irreversible damage he caused? As you think about your answer, let this be a reminder. Domestic violence doesn't just happen in isolation. It can spiral into unimaginable tragedy, tearing families apart in ways that can never be repaired. Case 2. By the end of the year 2000, only 4 houses remained in the area, one of them belonging to the Miyazawas. At first glance, their home looked like a single large house, but in reality, it was 2 attached residences. One side was occupied by the Miyazawa family, while the other housed Yasuko's relatives, mainly her mother with occasional visits from her sister and brother-in-law. The family had already decided to relocate, as their land had been sold to the city for the planned expansion of Sashigaya Park. However, Yasuko postponed the move, worried about how the transition would affect her children, especially Rei, who had a developmental disorder. As a dedicated tutor, Yasuko understood the importance of stability in education, and she even ran a cram school from their home, helping other children succeed. By all accounts, the Miyazawas were a close-knit, hard-working family, respected by those who knew them. But on the night of December 30th, 2000, everything changed. The morning of that day began like any other, with the Miyazawa family preparing for the upcoming New Year celebrations. Like many families in Tokyo, they spent part of their day shopping near Chito's Karasuyama Station, picking up festive supplies before returning home for a quiet evening together. They ate dinner, watched television, and eventually settled in for the night, unaware that their final hours were already counting down. What happened next remains one of Japan's most baffling mysteries, still debated and speculated upon decades later. But here's what we do know. Sometime after 11 o'clock that night, an unknown man made his way toward the Miyazawa home through the nearby Sashigaya Park. Using a fence in the backyard, he climbed up to the second-floor bathroom window. Some reports suggest he may have also used a tree, as broken branches were later found nearby. Once he reached the open window, he removed the screen and silently slipped inside. From there, the intruder moved through the house, first entering the nearest bedroom, 6-year-old Rei's room. The little boy was sleeping peacefully, completely unaware of the danger looming over him. Unlike the rest of his family, Rei was not stabbed. Instead, the killer strangled him to death, leaving his small body lifeless in bed before moving on to the rest of the house. Keep in mind that there are some inconsistencies in what exactly happened after this. However, some reports suggest that Mikio Miyazawa, upon hearing a commotion upstairs, rushed to check on his family, only to come face to face with the intruder. In an instant, the killer pulled out a sashimi knife, a long, razor-sharp blade used for slicing seafood, and launched a brutal attack. Mikio fought back, trying to resist, but the killer struck repeatedly. Some sources claim that during the struggle, Mikio stumbled and fell down the stairs, where he eventually bled to death from multiple stab wounds. Others say the killer initially attacked Mikio downstairs, and as he tried to escape, he collapsed near the staircase, unable to reach safety. However, one thing is certain. Mikio's body was found at the base of the stairs with a fragment of the murder weapon still embedded in his skull. With Mikio dead, the intruder turned his attention to the last two remaining family members, 41-year-old Yasuko and their 8-year-old daughter, Nina. Both were asleep in the attic, unaware of the horror unfolding below them. Unlike the previous attacks, the details of their murders remain shrouded in uncertainty, but forensic evidence suggests that the killer crept into the attic and struck while they were still asleep. Bloodstains on the futon hint at a sudden, merciless attack. At some point, either before or during the assault, the killer discarded the broken sashimi knife and grabbed another weapon, a Western-style kitchen knife from the Miyazawa family's own kitchen. This new blade would be used to finish what he had started. In a desperate bid to escape, Yasuko and Nina tried to flee down the foldable attic ladder that connected the upper level to the rest of the house, but the intruder was faster. Their bodies were later discovered at the top of the second-floor staircase, huddled close together. It was clear that they had fought for their lives. Nina, in particular, suffered a fate even more horrific than the others. She had not only been stabbed repeatedly, but had also been beaten so brutally that several of her teeth had been knocked out. Forensic analysis later revealed the most chilling detail of all. Nina was the last to die. Out of the thousands of cases we've examined, this one stands out as one of the most bizarre and unsettling. A cold-blooded massacre of a family of 4, 2 parents and 2 young children, should have been where the horror ended. But it wasn't. What happened next defied all logic, earning this crime the chilling nickname, the Goldilocks murder. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every week, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. Unlike most killers who flee the scene as quickly as possible, this one didn't. Evidence suggests he remained inside the Miyazawa home for at least 2 hours after committing the murders, moving about as if he had every right to be there. The exact sequence of events remains unclear, but forensic analysis paints a disturbing picture of what unfolded. After slaughtering the family, the killer strolled past their lifeless bodies, casually making his way to the kitchen. There, he raided the fridge, pulling out several tubs of ice cream, a bottle of barley tea, and according to some sources, even a slice of melon. Then, without so much as a second thought, he started eating, mere minutes after the brutal attack. But what makes this act even stranger is how he ate the ice cream. Instead of using a spoon, he squeezed the tubs until the contents pushed up to the top, then bit directly into them, leaving saliva and fingerprints behind. It was as if he didn't care about being caught, or worse, as if he wanted to leave a trace. As he feasted, he realized he had injured himself during the attack, likely from the sashimi knife breaking as he stabbed Mikio. Instead of panicking, he simply grabbed the family's first aid kit, patched up his hand, and left the blood-soaked bandages in plain sight. This careless act would later provide investigators with a valuable blood sample, but he didn't stop there. He then made his way to the storage room on the first floor and started rifling through the Miyazawa's personal documents. Strangely, instead of taking anything of real value, he removed an entire drawer's worth of papers, carried them upstairs, and dumped them into the bathtub in the second-floor bathroom. The meaning behind this act remains unknown, and then, in what is perhaps the most unsettling detail of all, he used the bathroom to defecate. He left the waste unflushed, further contaminating the scene with DNA evidence. Afterward, he wiped his hands on a bathroom towel, smearing his own blood onto the fabric before walking out. Some reports suggest he then took a nap on the family's sofa, but this remains a point of debate. What is confirmed, however, is that at some point he removed several pieces of clothing, his jacket, hat, shirt, and scarf, and left them behind. Alongside these items, investigators found 2 handkerchiefs, a fanny pack, and a pair of black gloves. Even more shocking, both murder weapons, the sashimi knife he had brought with him and the kitchen knife he had taken from the Miyazawa's home, were also abandoned at the scene. Although the exact sequence of events remains debated, one thing is certain. At approximately 1:18 in the morning, the Miyazawa family's computer was turned on. According to system logs, the killer not only powered up Mikio's computer, but also created a new folder. Some sources even claim that he used the internet to visit the website of a local theater company, though this has never been fully confirmed. The sheer audacity of this act, calmly using the family's computer while their bodies lay just feet away, only adds to the eerie nature of the case. Later, investigators discovered another log showing that the computer had been activated again at 10 o'clock in the morning. Initially, police believed this meant the killer had stayed inside the house for nearly 10 hours after the murders. The idea that he had spent an entire night inside, moving around the blood-stained home without a care, was chilling. However, further analysis revealed that the second activation was likely unintentional. When Yasuko's mother, Haruko, entered the house that morning and discovered the crime scene, she may have accidentally bumped the mouse, waking the computer from sleep mode. If that was the case, the killer most likely left the house between 1:18 in the morning and dawn, reducing the estimated time he spent inside to at least 2 hours. But those 2 hours were enough for the case to become one of the most baffling and chilling cases in Japan's history. The horror was discovered later that morning at around 10:30 when Haruko, worried that Yasuko hadn't answered her calls, decided to check on the family. As she stepped inside, she was met with a nightmare, her son-in-law Mikio lying at the base of the stairs lifeless. Overwhelmed with shock, she immediately called the police. When authorities arrived, they found not only 4 brutally murdered victims, but also a staggering amount of physical evidence left behind. There were fingerprints and shoe prints scattered throughout the house, DNA samples from the killer's blood, likely from the wound he sustained, and discarded clothing, including his own hat, shirt, scarf, and gloves. Both murder weapons were left carelessly at the scene, and in perhaps the most disturbing detail, unflushed feces in the toilet contained even more DNA. With such an overwhelming amount of forensic evidence, investigators were confident this would be an open and shut case. One former senior police official even remarked that the crime scene was a mountain of treasure, and that everyone thought an arrest was just around the corner. But in the years that followed, this assumption could not have been further from the truth. The clothing left behind provided a remarkably clear picture of what the killer was wearing that night, even down to where he had likely purchased his clothes and what cologne he had on. Police determined that the suspect had been wearing a gray Crusher bucket hat, a white baseball shirt with purple sleeves, a cheap plaid scarf with no tags, a Uniqlo AirTech jacket, black gloves, and a gray and black fanny pack. The various footprints left at the scene also revealed that he had been wearing Schlesinger sneakers, approximately 27.5 centimeters in size. With all this information, authorities created a composite image of the killer's attire to distribute to potential witnesses in the area. Once they had a solid visual of what the perpetrator looked like, investigators shifted their focus to the murder weapon and DNA evidence. In most murder cases, DNA is one of the most critical pieces of evidence, and the Miyazawa family's killer left it all over the house. From saliva to hair, blood, and even feces, his genetic makeup was scattered throughout the crime scene. While this should have been a breakthrough for the case, Japan's strict personal information laws complicated matters. Despite these restrictions, leaked reports suggested that the killer was likely between 15 and 35 years old, as he needed to be athletic enough to climb to the second-floor window. He was estimated to be between 5 feet 6 inches and 5 feet 7 inches tall with a slender build, as indicated by the 32-inch waist belt on his hip bag. DNA analysis confirmed that he was male with type A blood, and the contents of his stomach, as revealed by his feces, suggested that his last meal consisted of string beans and sesame seeds. However, when police ran his fingerprints through their database, they found no matches, indicating that he had no prior criminal record. Now armed with extensive details about the suspect's clothing, physical traits, and DNA, the police circulated the information to the public in hopes of identifying him. Yet, as days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, no one came forward with a name. One of the biggest challenges in the case was that, despite the abundance of physical evidence left behind, most of it was unremarkable. The clothing consisted of mass-produced items, sold in the hundreds and available almost anywhere. The fingerprint evidence yielded no matches within Japan's database, leaving investigators with little insight into the perpetrator's movements or origins. However, two particular items, the suspect's shoes and hip bag, provided much-needed clues that narrowed the scope of the search. The first breakthrough came from the perpetrator's shoes. Investigators discovered that the 27.5 centimeter sized Schlesinger sneakers he wore were never sold in Japan. Instead, they were exclusively available in South Korea. This revelation suggested that the suspect had either lived in or visited Korea at some point. Given that Korean law requires all citizens over the age of 17, as well as all visitors, to provide fingerprints upon arrival, the Japanese police collaborated with the Korean government to compare the crime scene fingerprints against their national database. Unfortunately, this search yielded no matches, once again leaving investigators at a dead end. The second clue came from the suspect's hip bag, which significantly expanded the scope of the investigation beyond Japan, leading all the way to the United States. Analyzing the bag's contents, police found grip tape used for skateboards, trace amounts of the men's cologne Drakkar Noir, and small particles of sand. Upon further testing, it was revealed that this sand did not originate from Japan, but instead came from Los Angeles, California. This revelation completely upended investigators' initial theories about the perpetrator, forcing them to reconsider the suspect's possible origins and connections. As time passed and tips continued to pour in, new discoveries emerged, each more puzzling than the last. Some findings helped clarify certain aspects of the case, while others only deepened the mystery. One such discovery came from a taxi driver who had been working in the area on the night of the murder. When interviewed, the driver recalled picking up 3 men near the crime scene. These men matched the general age and build of the suspect, and one of them appeared to be injured, even leaving a bloodstain on the taxi seat before exiting the vehicle. This report raised an unsettling question. Could these men have been involved in the murder? However, this lead conflicted with key evidence from the crime scene, which strongly suggested that only a single perpetrator had been present. Eyewitness reports also provided another strange lead in the case. The day after the murder, staff at a medical center near Tabiniko Station, several hours north of Setagaya, reported treating a man in his mid-30s who had arrived with a however. Despite their repeated questions about how he sustained it, the man refused to give any explanation. His reluctance to speak made the encounter suspicious enough for the staff to alert the police. Adding to the mystery were 2 handkerchiefs found at the crime scene, one intact and the other with a hole cut in the middle. Initially puzzled, police turned to the public for insights. Responses suggested that the handkerchief with a hole may have been used to secure a knife handle, a common practice among fishermen handling large fish like tuna, as it improves grip. Others speculated that one handkerchief might have been used to hold the weapon without leaving fingerprints, while the other was worn as a makeshift mask. However, this theory raised a contradiction. Why would the killer bother avoiding fingerprints on the knife when he left them all over the house? These inconsistencies plagued investigators for years, stalling progress and reducing the chances of catching the perpetrator. Beyond the overwhelming evidence, a major challenge in the investigation was identifying a motive. The Miyazawa family was well-liked, had no known enemies, and no apparent conflicts that would warrant such a brutal crime. With no clear suspect, police were forced to examine every possible lead, starting with the most common theories. In most cases like this, the first assumption is a burglary gone wrong. However, multiple factors contradicted this idea. Typically, burglars strike when a house is likely to be empty, yet the attack on the Miyazawas happened in the evening when all family members were home. More disturbingly, the killer's first act upon entering the house was to strangle 6-year-old Ray, who was asleep and posed no threat. If robbery was the goal, the perpetrator would have prioritized searching for valuables, not immediately committing murder. In fact, the killer only made a weak attempt to retrieve valuables after slaughtering the entire family. Yet even then, he left most of the items behind or discarded them in the bathtub. Some sources suggest that the killer left the crime scene with around 150,000 yen, roughly $1,500. However, what truly baffled investigators was that nearly $2,000 in cash was left behind. This led police to believe that theft was not his primary motive. If he had come just to steal, why would he ignore so much money? Given the sheer brutality of the murders and the killer's complete disregard for evidence, many believe he was either a serial killer or someone with extreme psychological issues and violent tendencies. The strongest argument for this theory lies in the killer's behavior after the crime. Rather than fleeing, he made himself at home, eating their food, using their toilet, and even taking a nap in their living room while the victims' bodies lay nearby. This lack of remorse was chilling. Another unsettling detail was the level of violence directed at the women in the family. Yasuko, the mother, fought desperately against her attacker and suffered severe injuries as a result. Her wounds indicated that she struggled until the very end. Nina, the youngest daughter, was the last to die, and her body showed signs of horrific overkill. Even after she had passed, the killer continued to stab and beat her, breaking her teeth and causing massive internal bleeding. This excessive violence led some to theorize that the killer harbored deep hatred toward women, possibly suggesting a personal vendetta or misogynistic rage. With burglary and serial murder considered, the only remaining motive was revenge. However, this theory had a major flaw. The Miyazawa family was well-liked, with no known enemies. Friends and colleagues described Mikio, the father, as a friendly and easygoing man who never stirred conflict. The only incident that stood out was a minor dispute days before the murder. Mikio had complained about a group of skaters making too much noise at the skate park behind their house. One of the earliest theories was that these skaters, angered by his complaint, decided to retaliate in the most extreme way possible by slaughtering his entire family. While this theory seemed outlandish, it did align with an early eyewitness account. A taxi driver reported picking up 3 men shortly after the murder, one of whom had a fresh hand injury. Investigators speculated that one of them could have been the killer, while the other 2 acted as lookouts. This theory gained further traction when police examined the evidence left behind. The clothes abandoned at the scene matched the style commonly worn by skaters at the time, and the killer's hip bag contained pieces of skater's tape. However, when police interviewed local skaters from Sashigaya Park, they found no suspicious individuals or connections to the Miyazawa family. The idea that a noise complaint escalated into a quadruple homicide was hard for both police and the public to believe. It seemed too extreme a reaction for such a minor grievance. Strangely enough, the most intriguing clue came from an unexpected source: grains of sand found inside the killer's hip bag. When analyzed, the sand was traced back to California, specifically to an area just north of Los Angeles. This bizarre detail raised a haunting question. How did sand from California end up in the bag of a murderer in Setagaya, Japan? The answer, some believe, lies in a controversial but crucial piece of evidence: the killer's DNA. Blood samples left at the crime scene allowed police to analyze his genetic profile, revealing something unexpected. The DNA suggested that the killer had mixed ancestry. His mother likely had roots in southern Europe, while his father had East Asian heritage. This revelation only deepened the mystery. Who was he, what was he doing in Japan, and why did he target the Miyazawa family? One of the most widely discussed theories suggests that the killer was likely military. Now, how do we know this? The answer lies in the sand. As previously mentioned, forensic analysis determined that the sand found at the crime scene originated from an area near the Mojave Desert in California, specifically around Edwards Air Base. Theorists believe that the killer may have been stationed at this air base while serving in the United States military, which is where he picked up the sand found in his hip bag. Later, he was transferred to Japan, most likely to Yokota Air Base, which happens to be located just about an hour away from the Miyazawa family's home. For this theory to hold up, the killer, now presumed to be a U.S. military member, needed to understand Japanese. Evidence suggests he could read Japanese documents, allowing him to decide which papers to throw into the bathtub and which to leave behind. Of course, it's also possible that he randomly discarded documents, but this is where his mixed heritage comes into play. Some believe the killer was the child of a soldier who married a foreigner while stationed overseas. This could mean that although he may not have grown up in Japan, he learned the language from a parent and possibly visited the country during his childhood, making him familiar with the area and local customs. This theory connects multiple pieces of evidence. First, the idea that the killer was military makes sense when considering the physical strength required to carry out such a brutal attack. Investigators initially estimated the killer was young because of the level of athleticism needed, not only to scale the back wall of the house and enter through the second-floor bathroom window, but also to commit such a violent act. Second, the possibility that he was part foreigner would explain why there were no official Japanese records of him. However, his partial Japanese heritage would mean he was fluent in the language and possibly familiar enough with the city's transit system to confidently stay in the house for hours after the crime, knowing exactly how to leave undetected. Since this theory ties together several pieces of evidence, it has become one of the most popular explanations among both the media and online forums. However, it is not the only theory that has gained traction. Years later, journalist Fumiya Ichihashi proposed a different theory in his book about the case, arguing that the killer was actually a former member of the South Korean military turned hitman. According to Ichihashi, the company developing the Miyazawa family's neighborhood may have hired this hitman to speed up the redevelopment process. Ichihashi pointed to DNA evidence that strongly suggests the killer was South Korean, as the markers found were significantly more common in Korean individuals than in Japanese individuals. If the killer had served in the South Korean military, he would have possessed the necessary strength and combat skills to carry out the attack. Additionally, this theory provides something most others lack: a motive. While the Miyazawa family had already sold their land, they repeatedly delayed their move due to concerns about their children adjusting to a new environment. Eventually, they became one of the last families remaining in the neighborhood. Ichihashi believes this may have frustrated developers, prompting them to take drastic measures by hiring a hitman. This theory supports several key details. The military background would explain the sand found in the hit bag, while the DNA evidence aligns with the possibility of a South Korean suspect. It also accounts for the Schlesinger sneakers worn by the killer, as the specific size found at the crime scene was only ever sold in South Korea. However, this theory leaves several critical questions unanswered. Why would a hitman linger at the crime scene for hours after completing his task? Why would he leave behind so much DNA evidence? Additionally, the sheer brutality of the murders, especially the fact that the victims were beaten and stabbed even after death, suggests a personal motive rather than a professional assassination. Another major issue is that the killer's fingerprints were cross-checked with South Korea's fingerprint database, and no matches were found. This means the killer was neither born in South Korea, nor had he visited the country, unless he had somehow managed to evade legal biometric records for years. One of the most far-fetched theories was discussed by investigative journalist Nicholas Obregon on his podcast Faceless. According to this theory, the killer may have been a child or teenager. While this might sound unbelievable, some pieces of evidence lend it credibility. A particularly suspicious post on the anonymous Japanese forum, 2chan, later renamed 5chan, adds to the intrigue. In a discussion thread where users shared experiences with animal cruelty, a self-proclaimed 13-year-old boy using the alias Mr. Korematsu posted something chilling. Now, when I see the happy family next door, I want to do something like that Oita family murder case. The closing date is December 31st at 11:59 p.m. I'm thinking about killing it off before the 21st century arrives. The Oita family murder case he referenced bore disturbing similarities to the Miyazawa family's case. In the Oita case, a family was attacked in their home at night, leaving 3 people dead and 3 others in critical condition. The perpetrator turned out to be a 15-year-old boy. The fact that the Setagaya family murder occurred just 2 days after Mr. Korematsu's post has led some to wonder if it was more than just a coincidence. Because the original poster was never identified, there is no way to confirm whether he was referring to the Miyazawa family or whether he was even being truthful. However, the theory raises some intriguing points. If the killer was a minor, his fingerprints wouldn't be in any criminal database, making him much harder to trace. Some also point out that the last meal the killer ate, string beans and sesame seeds, is commonly prepared as a home-cooked meal by mothers for their children, possibly suggesting that he still lived at home. That said, this theory contradicts several crucial pieces of evidence. It does not explain why sand from Edwards Air Base was found in the suspect's bag, nor how a 13-year-old boy could possess the physical strength to scale a back wall and carry out such a violent massacre. Because of these inconsistencies, most people familiar with the case dismiss this theory outright. Despite the flaws in each theory, investigators have had no choice but to explore every possibility. With no suspects and no leads, authorities have had to grasp at any shred of information. In a desperate attempt to solve the case, police even offered a reward of 20 million yen, nearly $190,000, for any information leading to an arrest. This is the largest reward ever offered by Japanese law enforcement, fueling an extensive investigation that has continued for decades. With over 246,000 detectives and more than 12,000 pieces of evidence, this case isn't just big. It's one of the biggest in Japanese history. And yet, after all these years, not a single step closer to justice. Every lead, a dead end. Every clue, a frustrating puzzle with no solution. But that hasn't stopped detectives from trying, even if progress has been painfully slow. For 2 decades, Setsuko Miyazawa has refused to let her family's story be forgotten. Rain or shine, she's out there at Chida's Karasuyama station handing out flyers, hoping that someone somewhere knows something. Case 3. On the morning of April 30th, 1997, the Altador family began their day just like any other. 29-year-old Marie Altador was at home, caring for her 2 baby girls, Samantha, just 2 years old, and tiny little Sabrina, barely 6 weeks old. Alongside them was Marie's mother, 68-year-old Teresa Laverne, who was there to lend a helping hand. Their home in Miramar, Florida, was filled with the sounds of giggles, baby cries, and the comforting presence of family. Like every morning, Marie's husband, George, left for work at exactly 7 o'clock. It was part of their usual routine. But as the day went on and afternoon rolled around, George did what any husband and father would do. He called home to check in. With a new baby in the house, he probably wanted to know how Marie was holding up, if the baby was sleeping okay, or if she needed anything. But something didn't feel right. The first call went unanswered, then the second, and the third. This wasn't like them. With 2 adults at home, someone should have picked up. Even if they had stepped out for a Marie, or her mother would have called back. But the silence on the other end only made George's worry grow. With this being said, he reached out to his brother-in-law and asked him to stop by the house. Maybe the phone was just misplaced, or they had gone outside for a bit. But when his brother-in-law arrived at the house, he was met with something that would shock him for decades to come. The bodies of Marie Altador, her mother Teresa, and her 2 baby girls, Samantha and Sabrina, were found under circumstances so horrifying that even today, those who witnessed the scene are haunted by the memories. The home that had once been filled with warmth, laughter, and the innocent giggles of children had been turned into something unrecognizable, a place of pure horror. But the big question is, who could have done this? The Altador family had no known enemies. In fact, they were widely known as a kind, loving, and peaceful family. They weren't involved in any conflicts, nor did they have any ties to crime. So why were they targeted in such a brutal and merciless way? To even begin to understand, we need to step back and truly get to know Marie Altador, the woman at the heart of this family. By all accounts, Marie Carmel Altador was a woman of quiet strength, resilience, and grace. She was originally from Haiti, where she grew up with big dreams of a better life. Like so many immigrants, she faced many struggles adjusting to a new country, but she never let obstacles break her spirit. Determined to create a brighter future, she eventually settled in the warm, welcoming embrace of South Florida. Now, Marie's faith was also an important part of her life. After settling in Florida, she began attending the Haitian Evangelical Baptist Church in Miami. It was there that she met the man who would become her husband, George Altador. Originally from Haiti, George was also known for taking both his religion and education seriously. Like many others chasing a better future, he eventually moved to South Florida, where he became an active member of the same church Marie attended. But they weren't the first to fall in love. In fact, George had been married once before, and even had a son with his ex-wife. However, their marriage ended in divorce in September of 1991. Not long after, George and Marie's paths crossed, and a romance blossomed. By February of 1994, they were married, and later that same year, they welcomed their first child together, a beautiful baby girl named Samantha. In the summer of 1995, the Altador family moved to Miramar, Florida, purchasing a 4-bedroom home with a pool in a peaceful neighborhood. They were settling into a comfortable and fulfilling life. Marie had started working as a secretary for the Dade County School Board's information office, where she also helped produce a morning radio program in Creole. George, on the other hand, worked as a plant manager for Aqua Air Products, a marine air conditioning company in Hialeah, a job he had dedicated over a decade to. On top of that, he had also earned his real estate license and began working part-time as a real estate agent. Those who knew the Altadors described them as a quiet, church-going family, deeply involved with their congregation. Sundays were always reserved for church services, often followed by gatherings with fellow parishioners and family members. Their faith was the foundation of their lives, giving them strength, purpose, and a strong sense of community. By early 1997, their family was growing once again. Marie was pregnant with their second child, and in March, they welcomed their youngest daughter, Sabrina. With a newborn and a toddler at home, Marie's mother, Teresa Laverne, who still lived in Haiti, made plans to fly to Florida. She wanted to support her daughter during this precious but exhausting time, and also be there for her granddaughter's christening, scheduled for the first week of May. Any mother knows that having an extra pair of hands during those exhausting first weeks with a newborn is invaluable, especially when there's also a toddler to care for. Marie was surely grateful for her mother's presence, helping to balance the joys and challenges of motherhood. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every week, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. On the morning of April 30th, 1997, everything seemed normal in the Altador household. Teresa had already arrived from Haiti, and the family was settling into a routine. According to George, he left for work at exactly 7 in the morning, just as he always did. Inside their home, Marie, Teresa, and the 2 little girls were still there, likely starting their day like any other. According to family and friends, George had a habit of calling home during the day to check on Marie and the kids while he was at work. That day was no different. He first called the house around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, but no one answered. Thinking little of it, he tried again an hour later at 3 o'clock, but once more, there was no response. This was unusual. Marie was still on maternity leave, meaning she was typically home at that time. If she had stepped out for a moment, her mother, Teresa, should have been there to answer the phone. But the continued silence on the other end of the line was unsettling. This got him so worried that he decided to reach out to his brother-in-law, asking him to go over and check on Marie, Teresa, and the children. His brother-in-law agreed, quickly grabbing his son and heading to the Altador house to see what was going on. They got to the house around 5 in the afternoon. For a while, they kept knocking and calling out, but no one answered. That's when his brother-in-law decided to try the door. To his surprise, it wasn't even locked. Remember, his son was with him at the time. As they both stepped inside, the first thing they noticed was the bassinet sitting right in front of the TV. At first, it didn't seem out of place, but as they got closer, their stomachs dropped. Inside, baby Sabrina lay completely still, her tiny body covered in blood. That alone was horrifying, but what he saw next shattered him even more. Just a few feet away in the kitchen, his mother, Teresa, was lying in a pool of her own blood. The brother-in-law was so shocked, so overwhelmed, that he immediately grabbed his son and ran out of the house, yelling for help. He called out to the neighbors, desperate for someone to confirm if his mother and niece were still alive. One of the neighbors quickly dialed 911, and that call came in at exactly 5:42 p.m., reporting what they had just found. When police arrived just minutes later, they had no idea what they were about to walk into, because the scene on the other side of that door would haunt even the most seasoned investigators for years to come. Just as George's brother-in-law had described, 6-week-old Sabrina was still in her bassinet in the living room. But the sight was horrifying. Her tiny body showed clear signs of a brutal beating. Officers believed she had been struck repeatedly with a blunt object. A few steps away in the kitchen lay Teresa, her body sprawled on the floor. She had been shot in the head and, like the baby, had also been beaten to death. But the horror didn't end there. As officers moved through the house, they found 2 more bodies, one in the corner of the living room and another in the dining room. It was there that Marie was found face down in a pool of blood, and her injuries are even more gruesome. She had been shot multiple times in the chest, stabbed, and then bludgeoned in the head. The level of violence was beyond anything the officers had expected. The last victim was 2-year-old Samantha. She had been found in the living room, wedged between the couch and a chair. Unlike the others, her position suggested that she had been trying to hide, but it hadn't saved her. She too had been beaten to death. The sheer brutality of the crime forced investigators to dig deeper, and as they combed through the house, they were left baffled. It quickly became clear that robbery was not the motive. The furniture was undisturbed, electronics untouched, and valuable jewelry remained exactly where it was left. Strangely, no murder weapon was found at the scene. Then came an even more unsettling discovery. There were no signs of forced entry. The doors were unlocked, nothing was broken, and there was no evidence of a struggle near the entrance. This pointed to a chilling possibility that the killer was someone the family knew, someone who didn't need to force their way inside, someone they trusted enough to let in. Outside, in the gated yard, officers found the family dog. But according to reports, the dog was friendly, not the type to bark or attack, even at strangers. This raised an even more disturbing question. Was the killer a complete outsider who simply went unnoticed? Or was it someone much closer, someone who belonged there? As the detectives continued searching the home, they stumbled upon a chilling clue in one of the rooms. A message scrawled on the wall in messy handwriting. "I want my $100,000 drug money. They stole my drugs." At first glance, it seemed to point to a drug deal gone wrong, a violent retaliation. But there was one glaring problem. After a thorough search of the home, investigators found no trace of drugs. No hidden stashes. No paraphernalia. Nothing. Even more puzzling, neither Marie nor George had any known connections to drugs or illegal dealings. This led to a series of unanswered questions that didn't add up. If this was really a drug deal gone wrong, why was the jewelry left untouched? Why didn't they even try to check George's office, where the supposed drug money could have been hidden? If they were desperate to get their money back, wouldn't they have searched every inch of the house? And the most disturbing question of all, why would a thief or a drug dealer take the time to brutally beat a 6-week-old baby to death? There was no logic to it. By now, it was clear to detectives that this wasn't about money. This was rage. The chilling message scrawled on the wall, demanding drug money, was nothing more than a smokescreen, a desperate attempt to mislead the investigation. With no signs of forced entry and no clear motive that pointed to an outsider, detectives had to consider a disturbing possibility. The killer wasn't a stranger at all. And the most obvious suspect? George Altador. In countless cases like this, when an entire family is slaughtered so brutally, the perpetrator is usually someone within the household, someone with a personal vendetta. When news of the murders first broke, George was caught on camera, devastated, trying to push past officers to get inside the house. He looked frantic, broken, desperate to see his family. At first glance, it seemed like the reaction of a grieving husband and father. But then, when it was time for questioning, his behavior took a drastic shift. Instead of being overwhelmed with sorrow or demanding justice for his wife and children, George was eerily calm. He didn't ask about the investigation. He didn't plead for the killer to be found. Instead, he simply said, "It's in God's hands now. God will prevail. Jesus knows." To detectives, this response was unsettling. Yes, George was known to be deeply religious, but his lack of urgency, his almost passive acceptance of the tragedy, didn't sit right with them. Most grieving husbands and fathers would be overcome with emotion, demanding answers, desperate for justice. But George? He was unfazed. He failed to provide any real answers, barely engaged in the questioning. And then, just as calmly as he had walked in, he got up and left. Although George consistently denied any involvement in the murders, detectives found it increasingly difficult to eliminate him as a suspect. His behavior, coupled with the lack of any other viable suspects, only deepened their suspicions. At one point in the investigation, George agreed to take a polygraph test, but the results indicated deception in his responses. While this was concerning, polygraph tests are not considered reliable evidence in court, and without any concrete proof to support the findings, detectives couldn't arrest him based on the test alone. Not long after, George stopped cooperating with the investigation entirely. He refused to speak with detectives and withdrew from public life, only strengthening their belief that he knew more than he was letting on. In the wake of the murders, George moved in with his sister and brother-in-law, avoiding the public eye. Suspicion followed him everywhere, and soon he stopped attending church and took a leave of absence from work. Those close to him said he knew people would start asking questions, questions he seemingly didn't want to answer. Meanwhile, detectives continued to pore over the evidence, chasing every possible lead. They ruled out robbery, they ruled out drugs, but no matter how much they investigated, they couldn't rule out George. A handwriting analysis was conducted to compare George's writing to the chilling message left on the wall, but the results were not a match. Even so, detectives couldn't shake the feeling that George was hiding something. One would think that if your entire family was brutally murdered, you would stop at nothing to help the police hunt down the person responsible. But not George. From the very beginning, detectives noticed something off about his behavior. While most grieving husbands and fathers would be desperate for answers, George was described as aggressively uncooperative during the investigation. He didn't ask questions, he didn't demand updates. And after just his second interview with police, he stopped speaking to them altogether. But then, detectives discovered something that shook the case even further. On the morning of the murders, at exactly 7:09 a.m., a call was placed from the family's home to Marie's uncle, who was living in Washington, D.C. at the time. He didn't answer, but his wife did. However, she wasn't sure who exactly she spoke to. Although she initially believed it was Marie, she wasn't familiar with her voice. And when Marie's family learned about the call, they began to suspect that it wasn't actually her. And here's why that phone call made no sense. The timing of the call was critical. It was made exactly 9 minutes after George was said to have left for work, where he arrived at 7:30 a.m. Now, if Marie was still alive at that time, then George physically could not have been the killer. There simply wouldn't have been enough time for him to commit 4 brutal murders and make it to work on time. But if Marie wasn't the one on that call, then who was? And could it mean that there was another suspect? Despite this eerie and unexplained phone call, detectives found themselves hitting a dead end. They followed every lead. They knocked on doors, questioned neighbors, retraced George's movements, and dug deep into his past. But after weeks turned into months, and months into years, the case stalled. A $155,000 reward was even offered in hopes that anyone, would come forward with new information. But as time went on and no fresh leads surfaced, the reward was withdrawn, and the case went completely cold. Still, Marie's family refused to give up. They held vigils and memorials to keep the story alive. They reached out to true crime shows, hoping the national spotlight might uncover new evidence. And throughout it all, they remained firm in their belief that George knew more than he was saying. The family's not giving up, the police department is not giving up, and we're still out here as if though it was 25 years ago. Police say their only suspect was Marie's husband, George Altidore, but say they never had enough evidence to make an arrest. I'm just telling them today, get ready, you will be found. Family members say not only are they hopeful that the killer will be found, they're sure. Police have done everything they can, but we believe in God is good and almighty and all-powerful, and there is nothing that God will not solve. And we do have a conviction. As the years passed, George moved on. A few years after his wife and children were killed, he remarried and relocated to Oklahoma. Now, his decision to remarry shocked Marie's family, but when they learned who he married, their grief turned to anger. The night before the murders, George had reportedly been at the home of a female friend, someone familiar to both him and Marie. He claimed he was there to fix an air conditioning unit, but rumors swirled that he had been having an affair with this woman. Though he was the only suspect in the case, he has never been charged in connection with the brutal murders of his wife, daughters, and mother-in-law. It's almost unthinkable that someone could slaughter for innocent people, including a 6-week-old baby, and still walk among society. The crime scene was so gruesome that many officers and detectives involved in the case required counseling to cope with what they had seen. The pain endured by the victim's family never faded, and the weight of their loss remains as heavy as ever. Justice may be slow, but it should never be silent. Cases like this remind us that there are still families waiting for answers, still victims whose voices need to be heard. And for us, it's an incredible honor to share the story of the Altidore family, hoping that someone out there knows something that could finally bring justice to this case. Case 4. In January of 1980, a family of 4 returned home after a long day filled with special moments. But for this family, tomorrow would never come. Teresa Gilligan, a devoted wife and mother of 2, spent her final moments not screaming, not pleading, but comforting her terrified children in front of their cold-blooded killer. And within minutes, the entire family would endure the most unimaginable horror, one so brutal, it defies comprehension. What's especially frustrating about this case is that the killer became more well-known than the innocent family he destroyed. And that just doesn't sit right. So today we're diving deep, not to glorify the crime, but to bring the victims back into the story where they belong. While justice may have been served, it would take 25 years before the remaining family could finally sleep in peace. And once you hear the full story, you'll understand exactly why. For this case, let's travel all the way to Evansville, Indiana, where the Gilligan family built their lives in the late 70s. By all accounts, they were the definition of a loving, all-American family. Patrick, the father, and Teresa, the mother, were both 30 years old in 1980. Together, they were raising their two young children, Lisa, 5, and Gregory, 4, in what seemed like a simple, happy life. Now, as mentioned earlier, there's not a lot of information about them online. But what we do know was that Patrick worked as a warehouse manager at L.B. Jones Furniture Company, providing a steady paycheck to keep the family comfortable. Teresa, on the other hand, dedicated herself to making their house feel like a home, warm, safe, and full of love. She made sure Lisa and Gregory had everything they needed, from bedtime stories to home-cooked meals, creating the kind of childhood every kid deserves. Back in those days, Evansville was a growing city with about 130,000 people calling it home. It was an industrial hotspot, with factories and manufacturing jobs keeping the economy strong. Most neighborhoods had that close-knit, small-town feel, where neighbors actually knew each other. Kids played outside until the streetlights flickered on, and families came together for community events. And the Gilligans were no different. They were active in their church, well-liked by their neighbors, and had a reputation for being kind, hard-working, and devoted to their family. Additionally, Teresa was involved in her community. She once chaired meetings for the Indiana Association of Legal Secretaries, and even led an astrology-themed talk called Age of Aquarius. Patrick, on the other hand, had been a star athlete in his younger years, even setting a discus record at Wake Forest before settling into a stable job in Evansville. But beyond their community roles, what really stood out about the Gilligans was how well they raised their kids. Lisa and Gregory were always dressed neatly, polite, and well-behaved, traits that didn't go unnoticed. Teachers, neighbors, and even family members often spoke about how much love and care Teresa and Patrick put into raising their kids. And unlike those picture-perfect families that sometimes turned out to be a mess behind closed doors, the Gilligans were exactly who they appeared to be, genuinely happy. There were no rumors of affairs, no marital fights, no dark secrets lurking in the background. In fact, just 2 days before the unthinkable happened, Teresa told her mother that she and Patrick were incredibly lucky. In her own words, she said, "There are so few people who ever find the kind of love we had." And just like so many true crime cases, tragedy struck when the family least expected it. It was January 14th, 1980, and Patrick had the day off from work. Days off were special for the Gilligans. They usually planned something fun for the whole family. And that day was no different. Lisa and Gregory had recently received Christmas money, so Patrick and Teresa took them out to spend it on whatever they wanted. It was one of those simple but cherished moments, a regular family outing, just parents letting their kids pick out toys or treats, something small that would make them smile. After finishing their shopping, they stopped by the children's grandparents' house for a quick visit before heading home. It was around 8 in the evening when they pulled into their driveway. Their house sat in a quiet suburban neighborhood on Aspen Drive, the kind of place where people didn't T-lock their doors, where crime was a rarity, and where safety was something everyone took for granted. That night, Teresa and her children were the first to step inside while Patrick stayed behind in the garage. But what they didn't know was that a man with a gun was already waiting for them. Before Teresa could even process what was happening, the intruder aimed his gun at her and ordered her to stay quiet. Her heart must have pounded in her chest, but with her 2 small children right there, she had no choice but to comply. The stranger forced them to sit down, his weapon a silent threat that he was in control. Then, using whatever he could find around the house, a vacuum cleaner cord, among other household items, he tied up Teresa, Lisa, and Gregory. Just as he was finishing, Patrick walked through the door. For a split second, maybe he was confused. Maybe he thought it was a prank, a misunderstanding. But then he saw his wife and kids, bound and terrified, and standing in front of them, a man with a gun. Patrick did what any loving father and husband would. He tried to reason with the intruder, hoping to defuse the situation and keep his family safe. But the man wasn't interested in talking. He forced Patrick to the ground at gunpoint, tying him up just like Teresa and the kids. And then, in a twisted attempt to keep them calm, or maybe just toying with their fear, he assured them that he wasn't going to hurt anyone, that this was just a robbery, that once he got what he wanted, he'd be on his way. But as the case later revealed, that was never how things were going to end. The killer would later admit that he never intended to kill the Gilligan family. But that shifted when Patrick saw an opportunity to fight back. As he rummaged through the house looking for valuables, Patrick managed to loosen his restraints. Fueled by sheer desperation to protect his family, he lunged at the intruder, hoping to overpower him. But that attempt failed. Because of this, the intruder now had what he believed was a reason to eliminate the entire family. In a split second, he pulled the trigger and shot Patrick. But Patrick didn't die immediately. He was still alive, struggling to hold on. The intruder, however, couldn't take any chances. He grabbed a dumbbell lying nearby and mercilessly struck Patrick again and again, making sure he wouldn't get back up. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every week. So if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. Imagine the sheer horror Teresa and the children must have felt in that moment, watching their husband and father being beaten to death right in front of them. It was a nightmare they never could have prepared for. The children must have been terrified beyond words, clinging to their mother, hoping for some kind of protection. And Teresa, despite witnessing something so horrific, stayed as composed as she could for them. Reports suggest that even after watching her husband's brutal death, she remained calm, likely trying to shield her children emotionally, if not physically. But none of it mattered. The intruder had already made his decision. Whether it was fear of being caught or something far darker, he wasn't going to leave any witnesses behind. In cold blood, he raised his gun once again, and one by one shot Teresa, Lisa, and Gregory, silencing the Gilligan family forever. Now, as it turns out, the Gilligan home wasn't the only target that night. The intruder had struck more than once. Later that evening, around 10:15 p.m., a call came in from a concerned neighbor, Ralph Hendricks, who had just returned home to find his house burglarized. In response, Indiana State Trooper Thomas Snyder was dispatched to Aspen Drive. Following standard procedure, Snyder began checking with nearby residents to see if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual. One of the houses he approached was the Gilligan residence, which was right next door to Hendricks. He knocked on the front door, but obviously no one responded. Suspecting that this house might have been burglarized as well, he walked around to the back and immediately noticed something alarming. The window on the door had been taped and broken through, likely an attempt to muffle the sound of forced entry. His instincts kicked in, and realizing something was seriously wrong, Snyder decided to enter the home for a welfare check. What he initially assumed was another case of burglary quickly turned into a horrifying discovery, a gruesome quadruple homicide. Inside, investigators arrived at the scene, and it quickly became evident that this was a burglary gone horribly wrong. Teresa's purse was found sitting on a chair, its contents rummaged through, a clear indication that the intruder had been searching for valuables. Nearby, a shattered gun case lay on the floor, its glass broken, and all the firearms inside had been stolen. But what stood out the most was the state of the entire house. It was in complete disarray. Every room turned upside down. Given that a neighbor's house had also been burglarized that same night, it became obvious that the crime spree had escalated into a horrifying tragedy. Naturally, the neighborhood was gripped with fear. Crimes like this simply didn't happen here, and the idea that someone could commit such brutal acts right in their own backyard was terrifying. People locked their doors, watched their streets more closely, and whispered in hushed voices about what had happened. But then, investigators caught a break. A neighbor recalled seeing a suspicious car lingering around the area the day before the murders. It was described as a light blue, four-door Plymouth, old, dented, and in poor condition. In a well-maintained neighborhood where unfamiliar cars stood out, this vehicle immediately seemed out of place. Police wasted no time in reaching out to nearby law enforcement agencies, asking for any reports of burglaries in the area, specifically those involving taped windows. Almost immediately, detectives came forward with a lead, two names that had repeatedly surfaced in connection with similar crimes. Richard Milligan and Donald Wallace Jr. were well-known associates with extensive criminal records. Both were habitual drug users who frequently resorted to breaking into homes to fund their addictions. Their history of burglary made them prime suspects in the Gilligan case. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered a key piece of information. Richard Milligan was known to own a blue Plymouth, the same car a neighbor had seen near the crime scene. Determined to track him down, police set up surveillance at his last known address, hoping the vehicle would eventually turn up. Hours passed as officers remained on high alert, watching and waiting. Then their patience paid off. The blue Plymouth finally pulled up, and police wasted no time moving in. However, when they approached the vehicle, they were met with an unexpected twist. The driver was neither Richard Milligan nor Donald Wallace Jr. Instead, it was a woman. The woman identified herself as Debbie Durham and explained that Richard had let her borrow the car. As police questioned her, they conducted a search of the vehicle, and what they found only deepened their suspicions. Inside, they uncovered a gun along with various stolen items that had been reported missing from the Hendricks home. This immediately tied the car, and by extension Debbie, to at least one of the burglaries in the area. She was promptly arrested and taken to the station for further questioning about Richard's whereabouts. While investigators weren't entirely convinced that Debbie was responsible for the crime, they also couldn't rule her out. At the very least, she was their strongest link to Richard Milligan. Under interrogation, Debbie insisted she had nothing to do with the Gilligan family murders. In fact, she claimed that Richard couldn't have been involved either, because he was already in jail at the time of the killings. This revelation changed everything. If Richard was locked up, that left only one other suspect, Donald Wallace Jr. Now, Donald Wallace Jr. was no ordinary criminal. Recently released from prison, he was the boyfriend of Debbie Durham and had a reputation that set him apart from the average crook. With an intelligence quotient of 130, Donald was known to use his intelligence to his advantage, manipulating situations to benefit himself. But despite his sharp mind, his life was defined by instability, crime, and a deep sense of resentment. His troubled childhood played a significant role in shaping the man he became. Born to teenage parents who divorced when he was just 5, Donald described his upbringing as loveless and insecure. After his mother left him in the care of his father, who showed little interest in raising him, his downward spiral began. By the age of 11, he was living at the Evansville Psychiatric Children's Center, the first of many institutions he would pass through over the next 10 years. At just 14, he was already deeply involved in crime, bouncing in and out of juvenile detention. There, he quickly learned that violence earned him respect, a lesson he would carry with him into adulthood. Before the Gilligan murders, Donald was mostly a petty criminal, committing burglaries to support his drug addiction. At first, Debbie was unwilling to provide any information about Donald. However, when police showed her the crime scene photos, her disbelief quickly turned to shock. She couldn't fathom that he was capable of such horrific actions, and that's when she finally started talking. Unfortunately, she had no idea where he was. The last time she saw him was the night before when he stopped by her mother's house. With this lead, investigators went to question Debbie's mother. She confirmed that between 7 and 9 in the evening, Donald had arrived in a blue car. According to her, he was acting erratically, carrying a jacket draped over his shoulder. Once inside, he laid out an assortment of items for Debbie to see, several guns, including a .38 caliber on his hip, the same caliber used in the murders, along with stacks of money, various pieces of jewelry, and miscellaneous valuables, including a camera. These items were later linked to the burglaries at both the Hendricks and Gilligan homes. Shockingly, Donald had Debbie's brother take pictures of him posing with the stolen items, eager to flaunt his crimes to his friends. But his actions didn't stop there. Debbie's sister recalled that after his impromptu photo session, Donald went outside and started a fire. When the family stepped out to investigate, they saw him burning a series of items, including the very jacket he had carried in earlier. A neighbor also reported seeing a man with shoulder-length hair standing by the fire. Acting on this information, an officer searched the area and discovered remnants of the burned jacket. Beneath the charred fabric, he found something even more incriminating, a set of wedding rings with missing stones and several pieces of glass, further tying Donald Wallace Jr. to the brutal crime spree. Debbie also handed over several items belonging to Donald, a pair of jeans, a ring, and a glove. The jeans were the same ones he had worn on the night of the Gilligan murders. When tested by a serologist, the fabric revealed traces of type AB human blood. This was damning evidence because Donald's blood type was O, while Teresa Gilligan and one of her children had type AB. The ring Debbie surrendered was another key piece of evidence. Donald had claimed it came from a jeweler, but in reality, it belonged to Teresa Gilligan. Teresa's mother identified it immediately, and further confirmation came from a jeweler who had resized the ring. The jeweler had kept a record of all the pieces his shop worked on, including photographs, proving without a doubt that the ring was Teresa's. The glove Debbie provided was also tested and found to be stained with type B blood, the same blood type as Patrick Gilligan. With this overwhelming stack of evidence, it was clear that Donald Wallace Jr. was responsible for the brutal killings. An area-wide manhunt was launched, with Donald's name and face plastered all over the news. An arrest warrant is out for 30-year-old Donald Ray Wallace of Evansville. This warrant is on charges of burglary, but the group told the news media that Wallace may be believed to have participated in the quadruple murder that took place this morning. For a full day, police searched relentlessly. Then, on January 15th, they received a tip that he had been spotted in Newburgh, Indiana, where he was hiding out with friends. However, by the time police arrived, Donald had already vanished. His friends confirmed that he had been there but had left, supposedly on a mission to find Debbie. According to them, Donald was well aware that he was a wanted man and needed to confirm whether Debbie had been arrested. Beyond that, no one knew his current whereabouts, and there was a growing sense of fear. With his violent past and the severity of his crimes, everyone understood just how dangerous Donald Wallace Jr. truly was. After a long and exhausting day of chasing false leads, the police were preparing to leave the office on the night of January 15th, when the phone rang once more. This time, it was a local coach named Bob Ashworth. Bob explained that he had been out walking his dog when he noticed a suspicious figure climbing up into the attic of a nearby house. Given the number of misleading tips they had already received that day, the officers were skeptical. However, something about Bob's tone convinced them to check it out. Upon arriving at the location, they met with Bob, who pointed out the house in question. The officers knocked on the door, and an elderly woman answered. She seemed surprised, but listened attentively as they explained the situation. She insisted that she had been home all day and was certain no one had entered her attic. Still, she welcomed them inside and granted them permission to check. The officers called up into the attic, but there was no response. As they cautiously climbed the stairs, one of them chambered a round into their shotgun. The distinct sound echoed through the small space, and suddenly a voice called out from the darkness, "Don't shoot." "I'm coming down." A man slowly emerged from the shadows, his hands raised. When asked for his name, he hesitated before answering, "Richard Milligan." But the officers knew better. The man standing before them was none other than Donald Wallace. Without hesitation, they arrested him on the spot. Donald later admitted that if he had known they recognized him, the encounter might have ended very differently. At just 22 years old, Donald Wallace Jr. was officially charged with 4 counts of murder. However, before he could stand trial, he was declared incompetent and spent the next 2 years in a mental hospital. In May of 1980, 2 psychiatrists testified that he suffered from acute paranoid schizophrenia, but in 1982, during his competency trial, witnesses and evidence painted a different picture, one that suggested he had been faking his illness all along. With that, his trial was set. Donald never admitted to the killings. He insisted that he had only been there to rob the house, and that an unknown accomplice was responsible for the brutal slayings, but no one believed his story. Even during his trial, he stuck to the same weak defense, but the evidence was insurmountable. On October 21, 1982, Donald Wallace Jr. was sentenced to death. Despite maintaining his innocence publicly, Donald had a different version of events in private. In a letter to Teresa Gilligan's sister, he finally confessed. According to him, he had been gathering random household items when he heard the garage door open. He panicked. Trapped with no escape route, he grabbed his gun and took control of the situation, holding the family at gunpoint and tying them up. Then, in a sudden and terrifying moment, Patrick Gilligan broke free. Donald shot him immediately. And then, in his own words, the killings happened so fast he barely knew what was happening. He claimed that after killing Patrick, he realized he couldn't leave witnesses behind. So, he turned the gun on Teresa. And then, in what might be the most heart-wrenching part of his confession, he said he couldn't bear the thought of the children growing up with the trauma of losing their parents. So he took their lives as well. In the years leading up to his execution, Donald fought tooth and nail to delay the inevitable. He filed every possible appeal, went on hunger strikes, and explored every legal loophole he could find. But eventually, he realized he was out of options. Just days before his execution, he publicly admitted to the murders, something he had avoided doing for over 2 decades. In a series of letters, he expressed remorse. He wrote that he was no longer the deranged dope fiend he once was, claiming that at the time, he had no moral compass and no real sense of what he had done. He wanted the world to know that he was sorry, that if he could take it back, he would. But he knew that was impossible. Donald's lawyer had planned to submit a 48-page clemency request in a last-ditch effort to save his life. But in his final days, Donald refused. He instructed his lawyer not to file it, waiving his right to ask the governor for mercy. "I'm ready to die," he said. After 23 years of fighting, he had made peace with his fate. "The dying part is easy," he added. "I'm so tired of doing time." On March 9, 2005, at the Indiana State Prison, Donald Wallace Jr. had his last meal: steak, baked potato soup, and chocolate truffle cake. He declined a spiritual advisor and spent his final hours meeting with a few visitors before being transferred to a holding cell. At exactly 12:23 a.m., Donald Wallace Jr. was executed by lethal injection. His final words were simple: "I hope everyone can find peace with this." That same day, Teresa's sister, Diana Harrington, held a vigil, not for Donald, but for the victims. She had spent years ensuring that the memory of her sister, brother-in-law, and their children would not be overshadowed by the man who took their lives. She continued that mission in 2007, when she and her husband, Ted, published a book titled Surviving the Death Penalty, a deeply personal account of the crime and the long-lasting effects it had on their family. Over the years, Donald Wallace became infamous, not just for the brutal nature of his crime, but also for the drawn-out legal battle that followed. However, if he hadn't stolen the lives of the Gilligan family, they would still be here today, living out the future they deserved. By now, Teresa and Patrick would likely be proud grandparents, watching their children raise families of their own. Their kids would have grown into adults, building lives filled with love, memories, and milestones. But instead, their story was cut short in the most tragic way imaginable. And while Donald Wallace is no longer alive, his execution could never truly erase the pain left behind that night, the pain of a family torn apart, the grief of those who loved them, and the lasting impact of such a senseless crime. Case 5. In the early 1980s, Keddie wasn't much more than a former railroad town trying to stay afloat. It was small, isolated, and for the most part, peaceful. For 36-year-old Glenna Sue Sharp, this remote town seemed like the perfect place to rebuild. She had recently left her troubled marriage behind, seeking a fresh start for herself and her 5 children. Though money was tight, Sue was determined to give her kids a better life. They moved into Cabin 28, a modest rental in the Keddie Resort, where other struggling families had also made their home. By all accounts, the Sharps were a normal family. The kids made friends, Sue worked hard to make ends meet, and life in Keddie carried on as usual. But on the night of April 11, 1981, something truly unthinkable happened. By morning, Cabin 28 would become a house of horrors. 3 people were found brutally killed inside. Blood was smeared across the floors and walls. The crime scene so grotesque and violent that even seasoned investigators were left shaken. To make matters worse, 1 child was missing, vanished without a trace. What happened in Cabin 28 was more than just a crime. It was an act of pure savagery, a night of unimaginable terror that still haunts this small town to this day. In 1979, Glenna Sue Sharp packed up what little she had and set out for a new life. With 5 children in tow, she left Connecticut behind, determined to escape a troubled marriage that had drained her for years. Her husband, James Sharp, was a military man, strict, sometimes controlling, and increasingly volatile. Their marriage had been marked by tension, and Sue had finally had enough. She wanted something better for her children, even if that meant starting from scratch with barely any financial support. Her journey led her across the country, eventually settling in Keddie, California, a tiny, secluded town nestled in the Sierra Nevada mountains. Keddie had once been a thriving railroad resort, but by 1981, it had become a modest, quiet community, offering affordable housing for struggling families. To Sue, it seemed like the perfect place to start fresh. She moved her children into Cabin 28, a small, unassuming wooden structure with peeling paint and creaky floors. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. Sue did her best to create a warm home despite the hardships. She was a devoted mother, strong, resourceful, and fiercely protective. Raising 5 children alone wasn't easy, but she managed. She stretched every dollar, took odd jobs, and received assistance from the government when necessary. Her children, John, 15, Sheila, 14, Tina, 12, Rick, 10, and Greg, 5, were adjusting to life in Keddie. John Sharp, the eldest son, was a typical teenager, sometimes rebellious, but deeply caring toward his siblings. He looked out for his younger brothers, often stepping in as a father figure. Sheila, the oldest daughter, was responsible and mature beyond her years, helping her mother with household chores and watching over her siblings. Tina, at 12, was quiet and shy, but had a creative side. Rick and Greg, the youngest, were still too young to fully grasp the struggles their mother faced, but they loved their new home and the adventures that came with living in the woods. Despite their financial struggles, the Sharps were a tight-knit family, doing their best to build a life in Keddie. The kids made friends in the neighborhood, and Sue had even grown close to some of the other local parents. But beneath the surface, there were warning signs, small, unsettling moments that hinted at something dark approaching. Sue had been receiving unwanted attention from certain men in town, particularly from Martin Smart, a local man with a violent past. He made her uncomfortable, but she brushed it off. After all, she had dealt with worse before. She wasn't the type to let fear control her, but the walls of Cabin 28 would soon witness something far worse than financial hardship or unwanted advances. On the night of April 11, 1981, the Sharps went about their evening as usual, completely unaware that their home was about to become the scene of one of the most brutal and perplexing crimes in American history. At 7:45 a.m., Sheila Sharp, the eldest daughter, returned home after spending the night at a friend's house. She had no reason to expect anything unusual. In fact, she had been looking forward to a quiet morning, maybe even sneaking in a little extra sleep. But as she pushed open the front door, her world came to a screeching halt. The scene before her was something ripped straight from a nightmare. Her mother, Sue Sharp, lay sprawled on the floor of the small living room, her lifeless body covered in blood. Nearby, her brother, John Sharp, just 15 years old, had been killed in a similarly brutal fashion. His best friend, Dana Wingate, 17, lay next to him, equally unrecognizable from the sheer savagery of the attack, and began putting together the details of a grisly crime. Murdered in this cabin were a young mother, Glenda Sue Sharp, her 15-year-old son, John, and a neighbor, 17-year-old Dana Wingate. The living room, once filled with warmth and laughter, was now a grisly crime scene. Blood splattered the walls and pooled on the floor. The furniture had been knocked over in what must have been a violent struggle. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood, and the silence that hung over the cabin was suffocating. Sheila's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to scream, but the shock had taken hold of her body, rendering her frozen. Her eyes darted across the room, scanning the horror before her, trying to make sense of it. Sue Sharp's body was found near the couch, bound with electrical tape and medical tape. She had been gagged with a blue bandana and her own underwear, secured tightly with tape. Her throat had been slashed, nearly to the point of decapitation. Deep stab wounds covered her chest and body. A claw hammer had been used to bludgeon her face beyond recognition. John had suffered a similar fate, stab wounds, blunt force trauma. His body showed signs of a struggle, evidence that he had fought back, but against what? Against who? Dana Wingate, the outsider among them, had also been bound and beaten. His injuries were severe. He had been strangled, possibly with a cord, and his head had been bashed in with such force that it left behind gruesome imprints of the crime weapon. It was then that Sheila noticed something equally disturbing. The back bedroom door creaked open. Inside, her younger brothers Rick, 10, and Greg, 5, along with their friend Justin Smart, 12, were alive, completely unharmed. The boys had slept through the entire ordeal, unaware that just feet away, their mother and older brother had been brutally slaughtered. But there was one person missing, Tina Sharp, who was just 12 years old. She wasn't among the bodies in the living room, nor was she in the bedroom with the younger boys. The only sign of her was an odd, empty space in the cabin, as if something or someone had been taken. Panic set in. Sheila turned and ran, sprinting to the neighbor's cabin for help. What followed was a small-town tragedy unfolding in real time. The sheriff's department was called. Neighbors began gathering outside, and within minutes, the quiet town of Keddie was plunged into chaos. The moment deputies from the Plumas County Sheriff's Office stepped inside Cabin 28, they were struck by the overpowering stench of blood. The small, dimly lit living room had been transformed into a grotesque slaughterhouse. The bodies of Sue Sharp, John Sharp, and Dana Wingate lay lifeless, bound with medical tape and electrical cords. The brutality was beyond comprehension. This wasn't just a crime scene. It was a statement. Investigators noted blood spatter on the walls, the floor, and even the ceiling. The sheer amount of force used suggested a sustained attack, one that lasted minutes, if not longer. One of the knives was bent at a disturbing 90-degree angle, a clear sign that whoever wielded it had stabbed with such force that the blade gave out before they did. Sue's lifeless body was positioned on her side, her hands bound tightly with medical tape. Blood had soaked through her clothing, forming a dark, ominous pool beneath her. But there was something even more unsettling. She had been partially undressed, suggesting the possibility of a sexual component to the crime. Despite this, there was no definitive evidence of sexual assault. John and Dana, meanwhile, lay side by side, their bodies mutilated beyond recognition. Dana's head was caved in, likely from repeated blows with the claw hammer. John's throat had been slashed so deeply that it nearly severed his windpipe. And yet, through all this horror, the most haunting mystery remained. Why had Tina Sharp vanished? Detectives quickly realized that the scene inside cabin 28 defied logic. The level of violence, precision, and sadistic overkill was unlike anything they had encountered before. But then a chilling detail emerged. The bindings on the victims suggested multiple attackers. The knots were inconsistent, some neatly tied, others sloppy and rushed. It was as if different people had restrained them at different times, each with varying levels of skill. Forensics painted a grisly picture of what may have happened that night. Blood spatter analysis indicated that John and Dana had been killed near the front door, their bodies later dragged to where they were found. Sue, however, appeared to have been the primary target, suffering the most extreme violence. And then there was the tape recording. Investigators discovered that someone had attempted to muffle the sounds of the attack. A section of the cabin's walls had been stripped down to expose the insulation, possibly to absorb sound. But most chilling of all, a small piece of medical tape, similar to the one used to bind Sue, was found with bloodied fibers stuck to it, as if a gag had been ripped from someone's mouth mid-scream. Whoever committed these heinous acts had not acted in a blind rage. This was controlled, methodical, and disturbingly ritualistic. In the chaos of the crime scene, one detail stood out above all the horror. Tina Sharp was missing. Her small bed in the back room was undisturbed, her belongings untouched. Unlike her brothers, who had been left alive in the house, Tina had been taken. But why? The timeline of events became even more twisted when neighbors reported hearing muffled screams around 1:30 a.m., yet no one called the police. Was it fear, apathy, or had the killers ensured no one would intervene? In the days that followed, search efforts focused on finding Tina. Helicopters scoured the forests. Volunteers combed the nearby roads, creeks, and abandoned train cars. Police even considered the possibility of a ransom demand, but none came. Tina had disappeared without a trace. Forensic evidence hinted that she had been alive when she left the cabin, but for how long? And what had her abductors intended for her? The weeks turned to months, then years, until finally, in 1984, investigators received the call that shattered any lingering hope. A skull fragment, along with a decayed blouse, had been found 100 miles away in the Feather Falls area. Dental records confirmed what investigators had feared. It was Tina. Her remains had been left exposed to the elements, her body dumped like an afterthought. But there was one final, terrifying clue. Not far from where Tina's bones were found, a tiny strip of medical tape lay buried in the dirt, the same kind used to bind Sue Sharp. Tina had been kept alive for an unknown amount of time after the murders, then disposed of when she was no longer needed. But needed for what? Despite the brutality of the crime, no one in Keddie seemed willing to talk. Witness statements were inconsistent, leads vanished, and possible suspects either evaded questioning or provided alibis that felt too convenient. Rumors swirled about the involvement of locals, people who had lived in Keddie before and after the killings, blending seamlessly into the small-town fabric. The two primary suspects were Martin Smart, Justin's stepfather, and his friend, Bo Boobed, both of whom had been at the local bar the night of the murders. Martin had a history of domestic violence, and just days after the crime, his wife filed for divorce, citing fear for her life. Even more chilling, he had allegedly told his therapist he had killed Sue Sharp, yet no arrest was ever made. Then there was the mysterious call. In 1984, when Tina's remains were discovered, an anonymous caller contacted the police and gave them the location before the news had been made public. How had they known? More importantly, why did no one follow up on the call? The case lingered in limbo, an open wound in the town of Keddie. Evidence was misplaced, records were lost, and key witnesses faded into obscurity. For decades, it seemed like the truth of what happened inside cabin 28 would die with time. Among the gruesome details of the Keddie murders, two objects stood out as silent witnesses to the crime. A claw hammer and a steak knife bent at an almost 90-degree angle. These weren't just crime weapons. They were symbols of the sheer brutality inflicted on the victims. But even more chilling, one of them disappeared for decades. When investigators first processed the crime scene, they noted that a claw hammer had been used to bludgeon the victims. However, one hammer that should have been there, a distinctive blue-handled hammer known to belong to Marty Smart, was missing. Marty himself even made an odd statement to police, claiming that his hammer had been stolen before the killings. This strange detail would only gain significance years later. A break tonight in a 35-year-old murder mystery. Investigators believe that they have found one of the weapons used in the so-called Ketty Cabin murders. CBS 13's Tony Lopez has the dramatic developments in this decades-old case. In 2016, more than 3 decades after the crime, a man scavenging in a dried-up pond just a few miles from Cabin 28 stumbled upon a rusted hammer. It was the same make and model as the one missing from the crime scene. Investigators immediately suspected that it had been deliberately thrown into the water to hide evidence. But with so much time passed, any forensic traces of blood or DNA were long gone. Another eerie detail was the steak knife found at the scene. It had been used with such force that it was bent nearly 90 degrees. This suggested one of two things. The killer was stabbing with uncontrollable rage, exerting more force than necessary. The victim fought back fiercely, causing the knife to bend in the struggle. Either way, this was not the work of someone who simply wanted to kill and escape. This was personal, sadistic, and prolonged. Adding to the mystery, another knife, potentially an even deadlier blade, was never found. Some investigators believe it was taken from the scene by the killer as a trophy or to further cover up evidence. As investigators pieced together the gruesome crime scene at Cabin 28, one question loomed over everything. Who could have committed such an unspeakable act? There were no signs of forced entry, and nothing valuable had been taken, which meant this was not a random break-in or robbery gone wrong. The sheer brutality and overkill suggested deep personal rage, and whoever carried out the act of killing wanted the victims to suffer. But why? And why was Tina Sharp missing? In the weeks that followed, investigators interviewed locals, neighbors, and family members in search of anyone with a motive. Very quickly, they honed in on 2 men, Marty Smart and John Bo Babade. The men suspected in the murders, Bo Babade, who together with the other prime suspect, Marty Smart, are now deceased. Marty Smart lived just a few cabins away from the Sharps and was known for his violent temper. He had a reputation for abusing his wife, Marilyn, and often clashed with Sue Sharp. Sue had reportedly been counseling Marilyn, urging her to leave Marty, which could have made him resentful. Marilyn later revealed that Marty despised Sue, calling her a bitch and blaming her for interfering in his marriage. On the night of the murders, Marty and his friend, Bo Babade, had been at the local bar. Marty's wife later stated that he came home that night with strange behavior, burning a pair of blood-stained shoes in their fireplace. Even more suspicious was a later confession Marty allegedly made to his therapist, where he admitted to killing Sue Sharp, but claimed he had nothing to do with the children. However, despite this chilling statement, law enforcement took no immediate action. John Bo Babade was a former Chicago mobster with a shady past. He had arrived in Ketty shortly before the crime was committed and was living with Marty Smart. The two had an odd friendship, with Bo frequently egging Marty on when he was angry. Bo had no known connection to the Sharp family, which made his involvement less obvious. But his criminal background and close relationship with Marty made him a strong suspect. However, no solid evidence ever linked Bo to the crime, and he later left town without a trace. Despite these strong leads, the investigation quickly fell apart. Key pieces of evidence mysteriously vanished. The tape recordings of Marty's confession gone. Crime scene photos disappeared from police records. No fingerprints, no DNA analysis, nothing that could definitely tie a suspect to the crime. Many locals believed there was a cover-up. It was rumored that Marty Smart had connections to law enforcement, which might explain why he was never charged even after his confession. Years later, new investigators reviewed the case and found that crucial witness statements had been ignored. There were rumors that Tina Sharp had been taken as a living target, possibly for human trafficking or ritualistic purposes, but nothing was proven. No one was ever convicted for the Ketty murders. Marty Smart died in 2006, taking whatever secrets he had to the grave. Bo Babade died in 1988 without ever facing trial. The case remains officially unsolved, though new evidence continues to emerge. In 2016, investigators found a hammer in a dried-up pond that matched the murder weapon missing from the crime scene. Many believe that law enforcement corruption and incompetence allowed the killers to walk free. Case 6. Back to the early 2000s, specifically 2003, and head to Heathrow, a bustling area in the United Kingdom. It was here that a thriving business called Saba Freight was making waves in the fruit import world. This wasn't just your average company. It was a booming empire. At the center of it all was a 46-year-old man named Amarjit Chauhan. Most people called him Anil. Anil's journey was nothing short of inspiring. He was born in India but moved to the UK in his early 20s with big dreams of building a better life. And let me tell you, he absolutely crushed it. He worked hard, climbed the ladder of success, and eventually became the proud owner of Saba Freight, a business worth millions. But life wasn't just about business for Anil. He had a beautiful family that he adored. Anil was married to Nancy, a stunning woman who was 20 years younger than him. Together, they had 2 little boys, Devinder and Ravinder. Their home was full of love and laughter. Nancy's mother also lived with them, partly to keep Nancy company, and partly to help out since Nancy had just given birth to their second son, Ravinder. Now, this family of 5 had everything you could ask for: love, success, and a bright future ahead of them. You could see how happy they were in the video footage shown in the intro. Smiles all around, kids playing, and a couple deeply in love. Life seemed picture perfect. But even with all this success, Nancy had one thing on her mind: home. She missed India deeply. The culture, the familiarity, the memories, it all pulled at her heart. She often brought it up with Anil, telling him how much she wanted to move back. She believed India's education system was better for their boys, and felt they could build an even happier life there. So, she wanted Anil to sell the business and start fresh in their homeland. Anil, on the other hand, wasn't one to rush big decisions like that, especially when it came to the business he had poured his heart and soul into. Now, if you ask anyone who worked for Anil, they'd tell you he was the kind of boss everyone wanted. He was known for being kind-hearted, generous, and laid back. In interviews with his team, they spoke warmly about how approachable he was. But like everyone, Anil had a past. Back in 1996, he had a run-in with the law and ended up spending 3 years in jail for tax evasion. It was a tough time, but instead of letting it define him, he used it as motivation to turn his life around. Once he was out, he poured all his energy into rebuilding his career and creating the successful empire that Saba Freight had become by the early 2000s. Fast forward to 2003, and this is where things take an interesting turn. A man named Kenneth Reagan showed up, applying for a position at Anil's company. However, Kenneth wasn't your average job applicant. He was an ex-convict with a history of smuggling drugs. At first, Anil was hesitant about hiring him, but then he thought about his own past. If he could thrive after a rough patch, why not give Kenneth the same chance? So Anil decided to hire Kenneth, giving him a fresh start as a driver. At first, everything seemed fine. Kenneth blended in with the team, and the other employees noticed nothing out of the ordinary. It was business as usual at Saba Freight. However, around this time, Anil was seriously considering Nancy's wish to move back to India. He had been mulling over the idea of selling the business, and then, as if on cue, Kenneth came in with some interesting news. Kenneth claimed he knew someone who was willing to buy the company, and not just buy it, but pay £3 million in cash. Naturally, this offer piqued Anil's interest. It seemed like the perfect opportunity to fulfill his wife's dream of returning to their homeland, while also making a hefty sum from the sale of his business. So, on a seemingly ordinary day, February 13, 2003, Anil left his office, supposedly heading to Wiltshire to meet with this mysterious buyer. The deal sounded promising, but here's the strange part. He didn't tell anyone exactly where he was going, or even share the name of the person he was planning to meet. It was as if he trusted Kenneth's word without question, eager to explore what seemed like the perfect solution to his family's plans. But then, Anil didn't return that evening. It was as though he had simply vanished into thin air. Nancy was starting to feel more and more anxious as the night went on. She had called the company, hoping to find some clue about Anil's whereabouts, but as expected, no one had seen him. Just as she was about to panic, her phone buzzed. It was a voice message from Anil. In the message, he told her not to worry, that he was fine, and that he couldn't make it home that night. He promised he would be back the following day, but something about it didn't sit right with Nancy. This wasn't how Anil normally communicated. She and her husband always spoke to each other in Punjabi, but the message she just received, it was in English. "Hello Nancy, don't panic. I'm okay. I'll be back tomorrow." The words sounded like Anil, but they didn't sound like him. That's when she decided to call her brother Unkar, who lived miles away in New Zealand. Unkar was a journalist, and though he hadn't seen Nancy or their mother in nearly 9 years, they still spoke almost every day. She trusted him completely and needed someone to talk to. But that call with Unkar would turn out to be the last time he ever heard from his sister. For days after that, on February 17, 2003, Kenneth made a shocking announcement at work. He told everyone that Anil had sold the company to a woman named Belinda Bruin. To back up this claim, he produced a letter stating that Anil had sold Saba Freight and was retiring abroad with Nancy due to ill health. The letter even had Anil's signature on it. The news took everyone by surprise. No one had expected such a major change, and naturally, the employees were now worried about their jobs with the arrival of a new owner. However, the reality of working in a busy company meant that they didn't have much time to stop and dwell on the situation. There was no time to question the announcement or voice their concerns. Everyone just had to keep working and adjust to the sudden shift, unsure of what the future held. Meanwhile, in New Zealand, Unkar, Nancy's brother, was growing increasingly concerned. After a routine missing persons inquiry, it was discovered that the family home was empty. Neighbors and colleagues all seemed to believe that the Chauhans had simply packed up and moved back to India, as Nancy had wanted. But Unkar wasn't convinced. He knew that Nancy or his mom wouldn't go anywhere without telling him, so if the police couldn't find any answers, he figured he would take matters into his own hands. He decided to fly to the UK and investigate his family's disappearance himself. Alone in a foreign place, Unkar arrived in Hounslow, the family's hometown, and headed straight for the Chauhan house. What he discovered there would shock him to the core, and it set him on a path that no one could have predicted. With compelling evidence that his family had left the house against their will, Unkar didn't waste any time. He went straight to the police, determined to get them to take action. After presenting his findings, he managed to convince the authorities to launch a full investigation into the mysterious disappearance of the Chauhan family. The case was handed over to DCI Andy Rowell, a seasoned investigator who wasted no time in getting to work. Rowell's first step: interviewing the last person known to have seen Anil Chauhan on the day he vanished, Kenneth Reagan. Now, as mentioned earlier, Kenneth Reagan was no ordinary man. In fact, he had a whole collection of names. He was also known as Ken Avery, but perhaps the most intriguing nickname he had was Captain Cash. The story behind that was simple but chilling. He was said to always carry around hefty sums of cash, often tucked into a case, making him a figure known in the underworld for his money and shady dealings. Before he became a part of Saba Freight, Reagan had quite a notorious past. Back in the late 90s, he was a career criminal, and not just any criminal. He was deep into the world of organized crime, running freight companies around the Heathrow area. But these companies were not just legitimate businesses. No, they were carefully crafted fronts for smuggling drugs into the country. Reagan knew the ins and outs of the criminal world and had connections with some of the most powerful and dangerous criminal families in London. At the time, Kenneth Reagan was living the high life, surrounded by criminals and making his money in all the wrong ways. He was enjoying the luxuries of his illegal activities, flashy clothes, expensive watches, and always rolling with a crowd of shady figures. But it was at a fashionable London bar, where Reagan's world collided with that of Belinda Bruin, the same woman who would later allegedly buy the company from O'Neill. Back then, she was a celebrity agent and socialite, living in the fast lane of the social scene. Belinda described Reagan as a bit rough around the edges, not well educated but charming in his own way. She saw him as the classic rich wide boy type, the kind of guy who thought his money could buy him class. As time went on, Reagan became fixated on Belinda. His obsession started when he began calling and emailing her relentlessly, saying things like, "I haven't felt like this in 30 years, you're like a drug." Rumors soon started circulating that they were in a relationship, though that was never officially confirmed. But on June 17, 1998, Reagan's world came crashing down. He was caught with 25 kilograms of heroin, a massive stash. Facing a daunting 18 years in prison, Reagan quickly made a deal to turn on his former associates and became a grass. His testimony led to the conviction of 12 major criminals, and in return, his sentence was reduced. For years later, when he was released from prison, Reagan found himself with nothing. His assets had been seized through a confiscation order, leaving him in a small one-bedroom bungalow with his father. Despite his fall from grace, Reagan wasn't ready to give up on his criminal ways. He was determined to make a comeback. And the perfect opportunity came in the form of Anil Chauhan's thriving freight company. Reagan saw it as the perfect front for his drug-dealing operations. Once again, he was planning to use a legitimate business to cover up his illegal activities. By this time, Belinda Bruin had given up her house in Chelsea for a fresh start in Devon. Reagan's obsessive calls and letters had stopped during his 4 years in prison, but now that he was free, he began to pursue her once again. A few weeks after his release, Reagan left Belinda a series of messages on her mobile, flirting with her. But in January of 2003, he left a message that piqued her curiosity, claiming he had a business deal he wanted to discuss. At the time, Belinda was dealing with personal struggles. She had a huge house, a large mortgage, 2 kids in private school, and her boyfriend had just left her. She decided to call him back. Reagan told Belinda he was planning to take over Saba Freight and needed a new managing director. Although she had no experience in the field, Reagan offered her a huge salary for just a 2-day work week. At first, he offered her £54,000, which she thought wasn't enough to cover her expenses. He quickly increased the offer to £72,000, which seemed more appealing. This job offer gave Reagan a convenient excuse to visit Belinda at her isolated home in Devon. He'd come up with bizarre reasons for needing her help with forms or letters, and he would drive all the way from Salisbury or London just for a brief visit. Reagan seemed increasingly fixated on the land around Belinda's farm, constantly complaining about the mud in the lane and suggesting ways to improve the property, like cutting down trees and building a wall with electric gates. Fast forward to February, 1 month after Reagan had told Belinda about the job offer, and things were finally falling into place. Belinda was given a desk and a computer, and she began reviewing the company's books as Reagan had instructed. However, on her second day, she felt unwell and decided to drive home to Devon instead of going to work. When she arrived, she was shocked to see a battered Jaguar and 2 men in her field with a digger. The men were William Hornsey and Peter Rees, both associates of Reagan. Belinda was furious and demanded to know what they were doing. They explained they were building a drainage ditch. Belinda couldn't believe it. It wasn't just the ditch, it was the fact that they had done this without her permission. Reagan arrived and tried to justify the digging by saying, "I thought you'd appreciate it." Belinda was livid. She made it clear that it was her land, and they had no right to dig it up. Though she planned to have it removed, she was told to wait until summer. By 2003, Reagan was on the brink of reclaiming his former millionaire lifestyle. He had taken control of Saba Freight, Anil Chauhan's former company, which now served as an ideal front for his drug-dealing operations. For years, Reagan had obsessively pursued Belinda Bruin from afar, and now she was on his payroll. It seemed as though Reagan's dreams were finally coming true, but the dark secret behind his success was about to be exposed. When detectives sat down with Kenneth Reagan to ask about the Chauhan family, they were met with a story that seemed almost too perfect. Reagan painted Anil Chauhan as a desperate businessman, drowning in financial woes and unable to sell his business. His version of events suggested that with no other options left, Chauhan had simply vanished into thin air. It was a convenient narrative, but one the detectives weren't willing to buy. Using cutting-edge forensic technology, the investigators tracked both Reagan and Chauhan's mobile phone movements on the day of the disappearance. What they uncovered was nothing short of chilling. Chauhan's phone, initially traced to the Hounslow area, suddenly pinged in the Stonehenge area just days after his disappearance. This wasn't far from Reagan's home in Wilton, Salisbury, and the detectives quickly connected the dots. Reagan's phone had met up with Chauhan's in that very location. From there, the 2 phones traveled south, moving toward Exeter in the West Country, a path that seemed more than coincidental. But the detectives' pursuit didn't stop there. They found a lead that seemed almost too unlikely to ignore. Devon, the home of Belinda Bruin, the newly appointed managing director of Saba. The police planned to visit her, thinking she knew more than she was letting on. However, just when they were about to get answers, a tip arrived from a man named William Hornsey, an associate of Reagan. Hornsey claimed to have important information about Chauhan's whereabouts, stating that Chauhan was very much alive and on the run. Hornsey's revelation that he was meeting Chauhan in Newport to hand over stolen passports seemed like the break the detectives had been waiting for. They rushed to Newport, heading straight to the location Hornsey had described, the iconic bronze pig statue near the passport office. There they found Hornsey and Reagan standing nervously. But something wasn't right. It was as if they were trying to spin the story into something else. Hornsey and Reagan claimed that Chauhan couldn't make it because, allegedly, he had somehow discovered that they were meeting with the police. The detectives, trying to piece things together, attempted to trace the phone Chauhan supposedly used, but their efforts were in vain. The number led to an unregistered phone, and once again, they were left with nothing but frustration and the sinking feeling that they were being misled, pulled further into a web of lies. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every week, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. Back at Saba, Reagan resumed his work like nothing had happened, as if he wasn't at the center of an investigation. But the detectives weren't about to let this slip through the cracks. They called Belinda in for questioning, determined to get to the bottom of things. When Reagan learned that Belinda was being questioned, his anger flared. He immediately warned her, telling her that if the police ever asked about his work on her property, she was to simply say he was helping with her water system. So on the day of the questioning, Belinda answered every question the detectives threw at her, but when it seemed like the interview was wrapping up, the detectives asked her if there was anything unusual about Reagan's behavior. That's when Belinda hesitated before mentioning one peculiar detail. Reagan had told her that if the police asked about him, she should say he was just helping with her water system. That one statement threw the detectives off. Without a moment's hesitation, they rushed to Devon, convinced that something grisly awaited them at Belinda's farm. They meticulously excavated the dig site where Reagan had been working, conducting an exhaustive forensic search. Forensic archaeologists and pathologists worked tirelessly, but after 5 long days of digging, no bodies were uncovered. At this point, it seemed like they were hitting a dead end. No physical evidence tied Reagan to any crime, and the case was on the verge of becoming a cold one. That is, until April of 2003, when a father and son duo decided to go on a leisurely evening paddle near Bournemouth Pier. As they glided through the water, something caught their eye. A bloated, lifeless body floating just beneath the surface. The body was unnervingly large and bloated, the feet floating above the water while the torso and face were submerged. The son immediately called emergency services, unable to shake the sight of the floating corpse. For nearly 3 long hours, the father stayed there, making sure the body would be found and the situation wouldn't go unnoticed. In an interview, he later recalled how that moment gave him absolute chills through his spine. The body was taken to a mortuary in Bournemouth, but it would be nearly a week before the authorities could confirm the unthinkable. It was indeed Anil Chauhan, the missing businessman. But the truth was far more chilling than anyone had imagined. An autopsy revealed a horrifying sequence of events. Anil had suffered blunt force trauma to the back of his head, a brutal blow that had left him unconscious. But it didn't end there. Packing tape had been wrapped tightly around his mouth, clear evidence of suffocation after the head injury. The forensic experts concluded that the combination of the blow to his head and the suffocation was the likely cause of his tragic death. While the police were still processing this shocking discovery, the search for more evidence pressed on. This time, investigators were zeroing in on Belinda Bruin's farm in Devon, hoping to find something that would link all the pieces together. And they did. As they dug deeper, they uncovered burnt clothes, jewelry, and even some hairs buried in the soil, clues that pointed to a burial site on Belinda's land. After forensic testing, it was confirmed. The hairs belonged to Anil Chauhan, and it became clear he had been murdered, buried at the farm, dug up later, and dumped into the sea near Bournemouth. The size of the excavation site raised even more questions. If they were just trying to hide one body, why dig such a large area? The detectives uncovered more clues, including jewelry that seemed to belong to Nancy, Anil's wife, and small poppers from baby clothes. It was a chilling realization. Anil's entire family might have been buried there too. With this new evidence, the investigation shifted gears. The case was upgraded to a Category A murder inquiry, the highest priority level. From then on, Kenneth Reagan was the prime suspect, but both he and his associate, William Hornsey, had mysteriously disappeared. One day, as Belinda was driving home, she noticed something strange. A familiar car parked near her property. Her heart sank when she realized it belonged to Reagan and Hornsey. There was no mistaking it. They were back, and it wasn't a casual visit. These were the same men she believed had dug a mysterious ditch on her land, a ditch she suspected was used to hide bodies. Her instincts screamed that something was off, but she stayed calm. Smiling nervously, she told them she needed to grab something from her shed and would return in a couple of minutes. The moment she was out of their sight, Belinda bolted to her car, heart racing, and sped off. She called the police immediately, describing the detail. Officers were dispatched to her home, but by the time they arrived, Reagan and Hornsey were gone. Not a single clue was left behind. That was the last time anyone ever saw the two men. But the story didn't end there. Days after the Chohan family had vanished, Belinda remembered something critical. There had been 3 men on her property that day. That meant someone else was still out there, and she was convinced it was Peter Reese. Now on his own, Reese was left to wrestle with the weight of his choices. As the days turned into weeks, guilt began to consume him. He bounced between hostels and boarding houses, always looking over his shoulder, knowing the police were closing in. One evening, while staying at a small boarding house, Reese struck up a conversation with the landlady. In a moment of weakness, he confessed everything. "Have you seen me on TV?" he asked her. When she said no, he unloaded the horrifying truth. He admitted that he was involved in covering up the disappearance and murder of an entire family. Reese insisted he hadn't killed anyone, but he admitted to helping hide the bodies. He even painted a chilling picture of Reagan, calling him a psycho who had personally shot 2 babies. The landlady, shocked and terrified, knew she had to act. As soon as she had the chance, she alerted the authorities. Within 12 days, the police caught up to Reese. He was still on the run, moving from place to place like a shadow. But even after his earlier confession, Reese refused to cooperate. He wouldn't share any details about the murders or reveal where the victims were buried, leaving the authorities with more questions than answers. While the police were interrogating Reese, they received shocking news. A fisherman had discovered a decomposed body floating in the water. The body was so deteriorated that the police hesitated to show it to Unkar, fearing it would be too traumatizing. But Unkar insisted it was his baby sister, Nancy. He couldn't imagine not seeing her one last time, even though this was the first time he'd see her in 9 years. And it was after her death, 2 months after the disappearance, the police finally found Kenneth Reagan hiding in Belgium. They brought him back to England to face justice. Surprisingly, 6 weeks after Reagan's arrest, William Hornsey voluntarily turned himself into the authorities. With Peter Reese already in custody, all 3 suspects were now under police watch. However, none of them cooperated. They stayed silent, refusing to answer questions or share details that could tie them to the crime. Even with all 3 men in custody, the police were still missing something crucial. Nancy's mother and her 2 babies hadn't been found. Without strong evidence, the police couldn't make a solid case for conviction. They needed more clues to ensure justice. That's when they decided to dig into the suspect's phone records, especially on the day Amarjeet met Reagan at Stonehenge. What they found painted a grim picture. The records showed all 3 men traveling south to Salisbury, stopping at an apartment located at 3 Forge Close, the address of Kenneth Reagan's home. The detective who led the investigation pieced together an alarming timeline. During the time Anil Chauhan was missing, at least one of the 3 men was always at Reagan's apartment. This led detectives to believe Anil was being held captive there, guarded round the clock to ensure he couldn't escape. It was during this time that the 2 men carried out their cruel plan, abducting the entire family from their home. The police believed that Anil was killed at Reagan's apartment, while Nancy, her mother Chiranjit, and the 2 babies met their tragic end in Hounslow. Despite this horrifying theory, the evidence the police had was purely circumstantial. They had no solid proof linking the suspects directly to the murders, and without it, their case remained shaky. When detectives searched Kenneth Reagan's apartment, they found no signs of a struggle or violence. The place had been meticulously cleaned and redecorated. Reagan had installed new carpets, replaced the couch covers, and made it seem as if nothing sinister had ever happened there. He had wiped away nearly all traces of what could have been crucial evidence. At this point, while the investigation strongly pointed to Reagan and his associates, the jury needed more than just theories and suspicions to convict them. The entire nation was watching the case unfold, gripped by the horror of what had happened to this innocent family. People across the country demanded justice for Anil, Nancy, their 2 young children, and Nancy's mother. Yet, with each passing day, hope seemed to dim as investigators struggled to find that one solid piece of evidence. Just when it seemed like the case might fall apart, a breakthrough came, one that no one could have anticipated. This pivotal moment came from Anil Chauhan himself, even in death. When his body was discovered, every item of clothing he was wearing was carefully preserved by forensic investigators. His shirt, pants, and shoes were thoroughly examined, but nothing was found at first. Months passed, and it seemed like the evidence they needed simply wasn't there. Then, 8 months after Anil's body was recovered, investigators took another look at his socks. And that's when they made a startling discovery. Tightly folded and hidden inside his sock was a single piece of paper. It was a letter dated February 12, 2003, the exact day Anil had disappeared. The letter was addressed to Kenneth Reagan at 3 Forge Close, Reagan's home address. Investigators believed that while Anil was being held captive, he realized he wouldn't survive. In his final, desperate moments, he thought of a way to leave behind a clue that would point to his killer. He folded the letter over and over again until it was small enough to hide in his sock, hoping it would remain undiscovered by his captors. The letter survived Anil's burial, the time his body spent in the water, and the months it took for investigators to find it. It was a testament to Anil's incredible courage and determination to seek justice for himself and his family, even when he knew he wouldn't live to see it. With the letter in hand, the case against Reagan, Reese, and Hornsey was solid. No jury could deny their involvement in the horrific murders. The trial began in 2005, 2 years after the crimes. It was one of the longest and most chilling criminal trials in the history of England's Central Criminal Court. The proceedings revealed the depth of Reagan's greed and cruelty, and the lengths he was willing to go to cover his tracks. Peter Reese, who had played a supporting role in the crimes, was sentenced to 23 years in prison. Kenneth Reagan and William Hornsey, the masterminds of the plan, each received 5 consecutive life sentences, ensuring they would never walk free again. Kenneth Reagan and William Hornsey, the masterminds of the plan, each received 5 consecutive life sentences, ensuring they would never walk free again. As the investigation continued, more heartbreaking discoveries were made. The body of Nancy's mother, Chiranjit Kaur, was found off the coast of the Isle of Wight. Like Anil and Nancy, she had been drowned. However, the bodies of the 2 youngest victims, 1-year-old Devinder and 8-week-old Ravinder, were never recovered. Though justice was served in the courtroom, the emotional scars left behind were immeasurable. Onkar, Nancy's brother, carried the weight of grief and unanswered questions. In an interview, Onkar couldn't hold back his tears as he wondered what his family had endured in their final moments, and whether they had held on to hope for rescue. This case remains one of the most horrific crimes ever, with the sheer brutality of it all sending chills down the spine. What makes it even more disturbing is the innocence of the family involved, their lives cruelly taken in such a violent manner. The idea that 2 young children were caught in the middle of this violence is almost too much to comprehend. Case 7. Monday, February 13, 2017. Abigail Williams, 13, and Liberty German, 14, known as Libby, were the type of best friends who did everything together. That Sunday night, they were at Libby's house, excited about a rare Monday off from school. Abby had brought along a box of arts and crafts supplies, and the two spent the evening working on projects in Libby's room and tossing a softball around in the backyard. By Monday afternoon, their creative energy turned into a craving for adventure. The girls came up with a plan to visit a local nature reserve near the Monon High Bridge, a well-known hangout spot in Delphi. They convinced Libby's older sister, Kelsey, to drive them there, and by 1:30 in the afternoon, they were dropped off near the bridge. Now, the area was a mix of rugged beauty and quiet charm, with wooded trails that led to the towering Monon High Bridge. This old railway bridge, built in 1891, had long been abandoned, but still attracted locals who came to enjoy the view, snap photos, and soak in the peaceful atmosphere. It was the perfect spot for two best friends to explore, laugh, and make memories. But what started as a fun adventure that day would soon turn into a nightmare, a tragedy that shook Delphi to its core. At around 2:07 in the afternoon, Libby shared a photo on Snapchat of Abby carefully walking across the old weathered wooden planks of the Monon High Bridge. Now, that photo would turn out to be the last known sign of the two best friends. Later that day, when Libby's dad arrived to pick them up, the girls were nowhere in sight. At first, there was confusion, then growing panic as calls to their phones went unanswered. Libby's dad searched the area, calling their names, but the only response was the quiet of the woods. He reached out to Kelsey, asking if she'd heard from the girls, or if he was in the wrong spot. She hadn't, and he wasn't. By evening, the fear set in. The police were called, and what started as a search by family quickly grew into a massive community effort. Search crews combed the trails and woods surrounding the bridge, while locals joined in, shouting for Abby and Libby. Attempts to trace the girls' cell phones led nowhere. According to the locals, that night was filled with flashlights flickering in the woods, looking like stars as everyone in the community came together to search for Abby and Libby. Some people thought maybe the girls just went off somewhere or were partying, but their families weren't buying it. As the hours passed, the search was called off just before midnight, with law enforcement reassuring everyone that there was no evidence the girls were in immediate danger and that the search would pick back up in the morning. The next day, February 14th, everyone was still holding on to hope, praying for a miracle. But then a shocking discovery was made. One of the search team members found Abby and Libby, but it wasn't good. The girls had been murdered, and their bodies were discovered less than a mile from where they'd been dropped off the day before. The authorities were now focused on finding who was responsible, but despite the many tips that flooded in, the killer's identity stayed hidden for months. This small town of just about 3,000 people was rocked to its core. The idea that two young girls were murdered in broad daylight seemed unfathomable, and the shock was felt throughout the entire community. One of the most crucial pieces of evidence came from Libby's own phone. Police discovered that Libby had been filming Abby as she walked across the bridge. In that video, she also captured the voice and image of a man walking alongside them. The man in the footage became known as Bridge Guy. Authorities believe this man is their killer. In hopes of getting public help, the authorities released still photos from the video, not the full footage, but enough to hopefully spark someone's memory. They also created a sketch based on witness descriptions of a man seen on the trail that day. Bridge Guy was described as a white man, around 5 feet 6 inches to 5 feet 10 inches, weighing between 180 and 220 pounds with reddish-brown hair. The grainy photos showed a man in blue jeans, a blue jacket, and a hoodie. Police had also released 2 sketches based on descriptions from eyewitnesses. One sketch looked like an older man, while the other resembled a younger man. Despite all of this, no arrests were made. So, in an effort to push the investigation forward, the authorities released a clip of the man's voice, heard saying, "Down the hill," in the footage that Libby had captured. This new piece of evidence was meant to stir up public interest and hopefully spark a lead. At the time, the police referred to the video as coming from possible criminal activity, trying to keep the focus on finding the person responsible. Another key detail that investigators shared was that they believed the murderer either lived in Delphi or was familiar with the town. Whether they worked there or had some other connection, the killer had knowledge of the area, and that detail kept everyone on edge, hoping someone would recognize the voice, the face, or the details and help crack the case wide open. In April of 2019, more than 2 years after Libby and Abby were found murdered, law enforcement held another press conference that grabbed everyone's attention. It was during this conference that ISP Superintendent Doug Carter made a direct appeal to the killer, telling him, "I know you're hiding in plain sight." He went on to say, "I believe you have just a little bit of a conscience left, and I can assure you that how you left them in that woods is not what they're experiencing today." By this point, the police had received a lot of tips, and there were quite a few people linked to the case as potential suspects. Some of them matched the 2 sketches police had released, but one name that came up early was Ron Logan. He was an older guy who lived in Delphi, Indiana, and his connection to the case wasn't just because of his age, it was because of where he lived. The bodies of Libby and Abby were found less than a mile from Logan's property, just a short walk from the Monon High Bridge, the spot where the girls were last seen. In a small town like Delphi, that kind of proximity made Logan a prime person of interest right off the bat. Logan had lived on a quiet country road near the trail that led to the Monon High Bridge for over 50 years. It was a peaceful area where families often walked, so it seemed like the last place something horrible like this could happen. But once the girls' bodies were discovered, that peaceful spot felt much darker and more sinister. Now, Logan didn't exactly help himself. When the girls went missing, he told the police he had been out of town at an aquarium, which seemed like a pretty solid alibi. But then things started to take a strange turn. It came out that Logan had asked a relative to lie for him about his whereabouts that day. That raised a huge red flag. If he had nothing to hide, why would he try to cover up where he was? Things got even more complicated a month after the murders when the FBI stepped in. In March 2017, the FBI got the green light to search Ronald Logan's property, including his house, garage, pickup truck, computers, and cell phones. In the warrant request, the FBI agent made it clear that there was probable cause to believe Logan had committed the murders and that evidence could be found on his land. The agent even went into detail about why they thought Logan was involved. But before we dive into that, the request revealed some new details about the crime scene that had never been shared before. First, the FBI confirmed that one of the victims was missing a piece of clothing. There were no signs of a struggle or fight at the crime scene, and investigators found fibers and unidentified hairs. It also appeared that the bodies had been moved and staged. The agent even referenced the infamous video on Libby's phone, confirming that it was 43 seconds long, though up until then, only a few seconds had been released to the public. The footage showed the suspect following the girls on the Monon High Bridge trail, and there were no visible signs of a fight. The search warrant for Logan's property, which was located right next to where the girls' bodies were found, revealed more suspicious details. The FBI agent said Logan had asked a relative to create a fake alibi for the afternoon the girls went missing. On top of that, cell tower data showed Logan's phone was in the area where the girls disappeared, and later that night, it was near where the bodies were eventually discovered. Logan's ex-girlfriends also spoke out, revealing disturbing details about his behavior. Both reported that he had been physically abusive, with one woman stating that Logan had threatened her, saying he could kill her and no one would ever find her body. The agent also mentioned that the victims lost a lot of blood, and it was almost certain that the killer would have gotten blood on their person or clothing. Additionally, 2 pieces of clothing from one of the girls were missing, and it seemed like the bodies had been intentionally moved and staged. The agent speculated that the killer might have taken a souvenir or done something to memorialize the crime scene. As investigators scoured Logan's property, they were hoping to find something that could link him to the murders. Logan, however, continued to insist that he had been in Lafayette, 20 miles away, buying tropical fish, and he didn't return home until 6:30 in the evening. But when police looked into his alibi, they found that his cousin, who was supposedly with him, didn't back up his story. In fact, they couldn't confirm any of Logan's alibi details. Despite the investigation, including extensive searches of his property, nothing concrete was found to directly tie Logan to the murders. He did have a history of legal troubles, including a previous DUI conviction, and as part of his probation, he wasn't allowed to drive. Investigators believed that was why he had asked his relative to lie for him. In a twist, Logan was later arrested for violating his probation, though it was unrelated to the Delphi murders. This gave investigators the chance to search his property again while he was in custody, but once again, no direct evidence was found that linked him to the crime. Suspicions surrounding Logan officially died down when he passed away in 2020 due to COVID-19. But just when it seemed like things had gone cold, another person of interest came to light. This time, it's a man named Keegan Anthony Klein. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every week, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. At the time, Klein was 30 years old and had a disturbing history of internet catfishing. One of the accounts he used was under the username Anthony Shots. Police believe that the Anthony Shots Instagram profile was used to solicit explicit pictures from young girls. But the story gets darker. Klein was actually chatting with Libby German on the day of the murders. Not only that, but he allegedly told another girl that he was supposed to meet Libby that day. It was hard to ignore the eerie coincidence. The last person to speak to Libby was an online predator. Was it just a twist of fate? Or did Klein somehow know the killer? Could he have been involved in the crime in some way? Police didn't waste time and searched his home in Peru, Indiana. Now Klein was never formally charged with the murders, but what they found in his home was enough to lead to serious charges. During the search, investigators uncovered explicit images of children, which led to his arrest on charges of child exploitation and possession of child pornography. Indiana State Police Officer Christopher Cecil testified that Klein used fake personas to convince girls, ranging from 12 to 18 years old, to send him explicit photos or videos. Investigators identified 11 victims, but they suspected there were even more who had not yet come forward. In a 2022 jailhouse interview, Klein admitted to trying to solicit explicit images from underage girls. However, he claimed that he never intended to meet any of them in real life, saying he was simply lonely and didn't really know why he did it. I don't look at teenage girls or kids. I don't think sexually about them at all. What do you think happened in terms of then, some of the things you're accused of doing? Like I told in the PSI, it just kind of spiraled out. I mean, I didn't have a girlfriend. I was a lonely guy and I started talking to girls online, and it just kind of spiraled into something, and I don't know. It's crazy. Klein pled guilty to the charges and was sentenced to 40 years in prison, with an additional 3 years suspended. His sentence was a reminder of the severity of his crimes, but it still didn't bring closure to the case of Abby and Libby. This was in 2022, 5 years after the horrific murders, and many feared that justice might never come. For years, it seemed like the case had gone cold. Investigators had little progress, and the community was growing increasingly frustrated. Then, on October 26th, that same year, everything changed when 50-year-old Richard Allen was arrested and charged with the murders of Abby and Libby. The news hit like a bombshell. Richard Allen wasn't some stranger or distant figure. He was a familiar face in the small town of Delphi. A family man, married with a daughter, and working at the local CVS pharmacy. Shockingly, he had even printed memorial photos for the victims' families. How could someone so deeply embedded in the community be capable of such an awful crime? It seemed unimaginable. But perhaps, just maybe, Indiana State Police Superintendent Doug Carter's words from 3 years earlier had been eerily accurate. The killer is hiding in plain sight. The case, which had seemed nearly impossible to solve, was now taking a startling turn. No one had anticipated how challenging this case would be to crack. Nearly 6 years of relentless searching, over 70,000 tips, countless sketches of potential suspects, and even the famous grainy video from Libby's phone all failed to lead them to the killer. As investigators finally closed in on Allen, it raised the question, how had they missed him for so long? Why did it take so long for this piece of the puzzle to fall into place? As it turns out, Richard Allen, who had been a local man in Delphi for years, had put himself on the trail the day of the murders, wearing the exact same clothing as the bridge guy described by witnesses. Even more chilling were the accounts from several witnesses who claimed to have seen someone resembling Richard on the trail that day. One witness even reported seeing a man walking down the road covered in muddy and bloody clothes. Then, investigators discovered an unused bullet at the crime scene that matched a gun owned by Richard Allen. This was a major piece of evidence that tied him directly to the crime. The arrest was swift, but Richard's defense team immediately released a statement, trying to set the record straight about their client and the ongoing investigation. The defense made several key points in their statement, and I'll quote them directly here. Richard is a 50-year-old man who has never been arrested nor accused of any crime in his entire life. He is innocent and completely confused as to why he has been charged with these crimes. The police did not contact Rick after Libby German and Abby Williams went missing. Rather, Rick contacted the police and voluntarily discussed being on the trail that day. Like many people in Delphi, Rick wanted to help in any way he could. He contacted the police to let them know that he had walked on the trail that day, as he often did. Without Rick coming forward, the police probably would not have even had any way of knowing that he was on the trail that day. Rick volunteered to meet with a conservation officer outside of the local grocery store to offer details of his trip to the trail. Rick tried to assist with the investigation and told the police that he did recall seeing 3 younger girls on the trail that day. His contact with the girls was brief and of little significance. Rick does not recall if his interaction with the conservation officer was tape recorded, but he believes the officer scribbled notes on a notepad as Rick spoke to him. The statement continued, stating that after Rick provided this information, he went back to his job at the local CVS and didn't hear from the police for more than 5 years. The next time he heard from law enforcement was in October 2022, right around the time of a contested sheriff's election. The timing seemed a bit suspicious to some. The defense team also pointed to the fact that Richard had not disposed of his vehicle, guns, or clothing in the 5 years since he voluntarily spoke to the police. He hadn't changed his appearance or relocated. Instead, he continued with his normal routine, which the defense argued was the behavior of an innocent man. However, things took another unexpected turn when months later, new documents revealed shocking details. The records indicated that Richard had allegedly confessed to the murders, not just once, but multiple times. These confessions were reportedly made during phone calls with his wife, Kathy, and even with his own mother. In each of these instances, Kathy would allegedly end the call abruptly. After these confessions, Richard's mental health rapidly deteriorated. He lost weight, stopped eating and sleeping, and even broke his tablet, his only connection to the outside world. He began acting out, engaging in bizarre behaviors, such as eating legal documents from his attorneys. This revelation took the case to an even darker place. The defense argued that these confessions were made under extreme mental distress due to Richard's protective confinement, and that they were not reliable. Despite the defense's concerns, the judge refused to move Richard to another facility, stating that he was actually receiving better treatment than other inmates in the same prison. But the plot thickened once again. The defense filed a bizarre 136-page memorandum, which shifted the focus away from Richard Allen and pointed the finger at a group of individuals following a pagan Norse religion known as Odinism. These individuals, the defense claimed, were responsible for the murders. In the memorandum, the defense referenced an FBI agent's disclosure in 2017, which revealed that the bodies of Abby and Libby appeared to have been manipulated and deliberately staged. Prior to this, very little was known about the crime scene. No autopsy results had been shared, and only text messages, allegedly written by Abby's uncle David, had circulated online. These texts revealed details about the girls' bodies. They were found near each other, touching but not bound. Abby was clothed, but Libby was naked, with leaves and sticks covering the top half of her body. Their throats had allegedly been cut. The most shocking part of this new development was the defense's claim that symbols resembling runes, associated with Odinism, had been found at the crime scene. They argued that these symbols were left behind by individuals connected to this Odinist cult, shifting the focus away from Richard and suggesting a far darker and more complex narrative. One of the more striking elements was the discovery of Libby's body, found positioned at the base of a tree. Her left arm was extended above her head, touching the tree, while her right arm lay by her side. Numerous branches were placed over her in a deliberate pattern, including one large branch running from her head to her legs. The defense suggested that the lack of blood near Libby's neck and tree indicated she may have been killed elsewhere before being moved. Abby's body, found just a few feet away, was fully clothed but dressed in Libby's jeans and sweatshirt. The defense proposed that Abby had been killed earlier and then redressed by the alleged perpetrators. Despite fatal neck wounds, little blood was found on her clothing, except around her neck, implying efforts to keep her body clean. Abby's body was positioned with her right leg bent beneath her left leg, and branches were arranged in a pattern on top of her, resembling an asterisk. The defense also noted that one of the branches appeared to be cleanly cut, suggesting premeditation. Above Abby's head, smaller sticks were placed over her hair, mimicking horns or antlers. Further unsettling details included a red F-shaped stain on a nearby tree, confirmed to be Libby's blood. The defense argued that this symbol resembled the Norse rune Ansuz, which stands for Odin. They also pointed to the symbol Hagalaz found on Abby's body, linking it to the Norse god of hail. The defense theorized that these runes suggested a ritualistic motive behind the killings. The defense challenged the prosecution's timeline, which suggested the murders occurred within a short window, claiming it was implausible for one person, especially someone of Richard Allen's small stature, to have committed the murders alone. They raised questions about the discovery of a bullet buried between the girls, and its connection to a gun owned by Allen, asking when it was found. Immediately after the bodies were discovered or days later, the defense argued that the murders required more time than one person could manage in such a short window. The defense also pointed to the connection between Abby and Odinism. Abby's alleged boyfriend's father, known as BH, had ties to Odinism and social media posts resembling the symbols found at the crime scene. The defense claimed that BH had made references to the crime scene before details were publicly released. The theory also included the disturbing meme posted by BH days after the murders, joking about helping dispose of bodies and remaining silent. Another potential suspect was mentioned by the defense, who claimed he admitted to being involved in the murders. The defense also alleged that several law enforcement officers involved in the investigation privately believed in the Odinism theory, but were suppressed to focus on Allen. In terms of Allen's mental health, the defense argued that his deteriorating condition in prison may have led to coerced confessions. They claimed that threats from Odinist members working as guards had pressured him into confessing. Additionally, they accused the lead investigator of withholding crucial evidence to gain a search warrant for Allen's home. Another significant issue raised was the destruction of evidence. The defense claimed that 70 days' worth of interviews with witnesses had been destroyed, which could have been crucial in the early stages of the investigation. This led to further frustrations from the defense as they sought to challenge the prosecution's case. During a 3-day hearing in 2024, the defense's Odinism theory was debated, with the prosecution presenting evidence to refute it. The prosecution called in a blood spatter expert who testified that the blood on the tree was a transfer stain, not painted, though the expert couldn't determine who transferred the blood. The defense also argued that Allen's confessions, over 60 in total, were coerced and should not be admissible in court. They argued that Allen's mental health had worsened due to his severe treatment in a maximum security facility, leading to stress-induced psychosis. Several witnesses testified to Allen's deteriorating condition, including his bizarre behavior and his eventual confession to the murders. A DNA expert also testified that there was no trace of Allen's DNA at the crime scene, and there was also no sign of Libby or Abby's DNA on any of the items found at his home. So, while his confession seemed to be a big step toward closing the case, physical evidence wasn't quite backing up his involvement. The only key piece of evidence prosecutors focused on was the .40 caliber bullet found near the girls' bodies. An expert for the prosecution claimed it matched Allen's gun, but the defense wasn't buying it, pointing out that there weren't enough images taken of the cartridge, and even suggested that the bullet could have come from a law enforcement officer's weapon. That raised a lot of eyebrows about the reliability of this piece of evidence. The prosecution also worked hard to link Allen to the chilling bridge guy video and audio recording taken by Libby on her phone just before the girls were murdered. State Police Master Trooper Brian Harshman, who reviewed over 700 of Allen's prison calls, testified that, in his opinion, the voice on that recording matched Allen's voice. It was a bold statement, but some still had their doubts. Then the moment arrived. On November 11, 2024, Allen was convicted on all counts. Just a month later, on December 20, 2024, Judge Gull sentenced him to 130 years in prison, 65 years for each of the girls' murders, to be served consecutively. He was immediately transported to the Westville Correctional Facility to start serving his time. But here's the thing. While some people were relieved to see justice served, there's still a big divide. A lot of people are questioning how it took 5 years for anyone to connect Allen to the case. There were those sketches, the videos, the voices, so why didn't anyone think to investigate Allen sooner? And let's not forget that his arrest happened just in time for a sheriff election, which raised even more suspicions.